Hey friends! Glad you're here at Gringotts Hub. We've cooked up something special. What if Harry used the Founders' combined ring to summon spirits of all 4 Founders and they sued Dumbledore together? Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1, The Hollow Ground. The Dursleys had stopped pretending they weren't afraid of him. That was the first real change Harry noticed after he came back from Hogwarts, not the silence at dinner, not the way Vernon's eyes tracked the door whenever Harry entered a room, but the quality of the fear. Last year it had been contemptuous, performative, the kind of fear that needed to express itself as cruelty to stay comfortable. This summer it was the other kind. The quiet kind. The kind that made Dudley take the long way around the upstairs landing just to avoid passing Harry's door, and made Petunia set his plate at the very edge of the table so her fingers never got close to his. He didn't particularly enjoy it. He just didn't have the energy left to care. Sirius had been dead for 3 weeks. Harry had stopped counting days somewhere around the end of the first week, when counting felt too much like expecting something to change. Nothing was going to change. Sirius was gone in the particular, irretrievable way that the Department of Mysteries had made brutally clear, a way that didn't leave a body to bury or a grave to visit, just a curtain stirring in a cold room and the echo of a laugh that Harry heard every time the house went quiet. Which was often. The Dursleys were very good at quiet, this summer. He spent most of his time in his room. Not sleeping, he'd given up on sleeping as a primary activity around day 4, when the dream started. Not reading either, though the books were stacked by the window in an optimistic pile Hermione had old along with a letter full of caring words he'd read twice and then folded away because reading them a third time would mean feeling them and he wasn't ready for that. Mostly he sat at the desk and looked out the window at the identical rooftops of Privet Drive and thought about the prophecy, which Dumbledore had finally told him in that devastated conversation at the end of term, and which sat in his chest now like a stone that hadn't finished sinking. Neither can live while the other survives. He turned it over in his head the way you turn a rock over to see what's underneath, and every time he found the same thing, that his life had never really been his own. That everything, Hogwarts, the friendships, the Quidditch, the dumb brilliant moments of ordinary happiness, had been scaffolding around a single inevitable structure. He was a weapon. He'd been shaped into one, carefully, over 15 years. And the man who'd done most of the shaping had looked at him across a headmaster's office full of broken instruments and said, "I'm sorry, Harry," and Harry had believed him and hated him simultaneously, and wasn't sure which feeling was more exhausting. He was thinking about all of this on a Tuesday morning in the second week of July when the letter arrived. Not from Hermione, not from Ron, not from anyone he expected. The owl was one he didn't recognize, old, tawny, moving with the slow deliberate grace of something that had been flying for a very long time. It landed on his windowsill and held out its leg with a dignity that somehow made Harry sit up straighter before he even knew what he was doing. The envelope was thick, cream-colored parchment, heavier than it looked. His name on the front was written in a hand he didn't recognize, not spidery like Dumbledore's, not the careful looping cursive of the Ministry's official correspondence, but something older, the letters formed with a kind of architectural precision that made them look less written and more constructed. There was no return address. There was no ministry seal. There was a small symbol pressed into the wax on the back, and Harry stared at it for a long moment before recognizing it as a combination of 4 emblems, a lion, a badger, an eagle, and a snake, interlocked in a pattern so tight and deliberate they looked like a single creature. He opened it. The letter inside was short. 1 paragraph, that same precise hand. You are the last living bloodline of Godric Gryffindor through the maternal line, a fact obscured by generations of name changes, war, and deliberate misdirection. Beneath the foundation of the house at Godric's Hollow, in the cellar your parents sealed before they died, there is a chamber. In the chamber there is a ring. The ring knows you. It has been waiting. If you are reading this letter, then the Covenant has decided the time is right. Come alone. Come soon. There was no signature. Harry read it 3 times. Then he went downstairs, told Vernon he was going out, and walked to the end of Privet Drive before Vernon had finished formulating his objection. He sat on the low wall at the corner for about 10 minutes, turning the letter over in his hands, running his thumb across that interlocked emblem in the wax. The rational part of his brain, the part that had survived 5 years of Hogwarts by maintaining at least a passing relationship with caution, was pointing out several things in rapid succession. He didn't know who sent this. It could be a trap. Voldemort had used bait before. He was supposed to stay at Privet Drive for the protection. He should write to Dumbledore. He should write to Dumbledore. That thought sat there for a moment, and then quietly dissolved. Because the other thing that had been sitting in his chest alongside the prophecy, the stone of neither can live while the other survives, was something older and rawer and less philosophical. It was the memory of a letter his father had written when Harry was 1 year old, a letter Moody had shown him, full of his father's cheerful offhand brilliance, mentioning Dumbledore's orders, Dumbledore's plan. Dumbledore says we should stay hidden, Dumbledore thinks it's nearly over. It was the memory of a conversation he'd had with Sirius in the Department of Mysteries. Dumbledore knew about that prophecy for 15 years, Harry, 15 years, that he'd been turning over ever since, because Sirius had said it so casually, like it was old news, like it was just one of those things, and Harry had been too overwhelmed in the moment to really hear it. He'd heard it now. Dumbledore had known about the prophecy when Harry was 1 year old. Had known what it meant for Harry's life. Had known that Harry was either going to kill Voldemort or die trying, and had spent 15 years engineering the path to that outcome. Had put a 1-year-old with the Dursleys. Had watched, from a careful distance, as Harry grew up in a cupboard under the stairs and developed the particular brand of resilient, self-effacing, other-prioritizing personality that you develop when you grow up being told you don't deserve to take up space, and Harry wondered now, really wondered, for the first time, cold and clear, how much of that had been a coincidence. He got off the wall and started walking toward the bus stop. Godric's Hollow was in the West Country, a few hours by Muggle transport. Harry took the bus to the nearest large town, drew money from the Gringotts ATM card Hermione had helped him set up 2 summers ago, one of the smartest things he'd ever done, and caught a train. He watched the city give way to suburbs give way to countryside and thought about his parents and the house they'd died in, which he'd never visited, and the fact that he'd had to learn his mother was descended from one of the most powerful wizards in history from an unsigned letter delivered by a strange owl. He wasn't angry about it. Or rather, he was, but the anger was quiet now, a low background hum that had replaced the explosive grief of those first terrible weeks. Quiet anger was more useful. Quiet anger let you think. He arrived in the village of Godric's Hollow in the early afternoon. He'd expected to feel something large and significant when he stepped off the small local bus at the village green. This was, after all, the place where everything had started, the place where his parents had died, the place whose name had been part of his mythology since he was old enough to hear the word family. What he actually felt was smaller and stranger than that. The village was just a village. Cottages with window boxes. A pub. A war memorial in the square that he'd read about in Hogwarts, a history, a statue that revealed itself as a family of 3 to those with magical sight, a father and mother and child who looked nothing like his mental image of his parents but made his throat tighten anyway. He stood in front of it for a while. Then he found the house. What remained of it was down a lane off the main road, set behind an overgrown garden that must have been lovely once. The house itself was a ruin. The upper story partly collapsed, the roof open to the sky, the whole structure preserved in some kind of stasis that kept it standing despite decades of neglect. There was a wooden sign in front of it that he suspected could only be read by magical eyes. He could read it. It said, "Here, on the night of October 31st, 1981, James and Lily Potter gave their lives. Their sacrifice is not forgotten." It was a strange sentence. Very official. Very removed. Gave their lives, as though they'd had a choice in it, as though Voldemort had given them a moment to deliberate and they'd reached a considered decision. He stood there for a moment looking at it, then walked through the gate. The garden swallowed his footsteps. Whatever charm kept the house standing also seemed to keep the garden in a particular kind of arrested growth, the weeds knee-high but no higher, the grass long but not impenetrable, as though the whole property had been frozen on an autumn afternoon 30 years ago and the world had simply continued around it. He found the front door intact, the wood swollen and weathered but holding. There was no lock, or rather, there had been one, but it dissolved when Harry reached for the handle. Just dissolved, the metal going soft and then nothing, like it had only ever been waiting for him to arrive. Inside smelled of old stone and something fainter, almost herbal, that he couldn't identify. He moved through the ground floor quickly, he didn't linger, didn't examine the remnants of furniture or the photographs still on the walls, faces he recognized and didn't trust himself to look at for too long, not yet. He was looking for the cellar door. He found it under a rug in the kitchen, almost exactly where he'd imagined it from the letter. The trapdoor was made of the same stone as the foundation, seamlessly integrated, and like the front door it had responded to his touch before he'd done anything deliberate, a line of light appearing around its edges when he crouched down and spread his palm flat against it. The stone was warm. Startlingly, specifically warm, like something alive. He pulled it open. The stairs going down were narrow and carved directly from the earth, their edges smoothed with age. Harry lit his wand and went down. The chamber was not large, maybe the size of his dormitory at Hogwarts, the ceiling low enough that he had to duck slightly as he reached the bottom of the stairs. But it had clearly been made with intent. The walls weren't raw earth or rough stone but something in between, smoothed and somehow hardened and then carved, not with words but with patterns, the same interlocked emblem from the letter wax reproduced here in enormous detail across all four walls and the ceiling. Lion, badger, eagle, snake. In the wandlight they seemed to shift, each image trading foreground with the others as his light moved, and the effect was less unsettling than hypnotic. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal. Simple, waist-high, flat on top. On the pedestal was the ring. Harry crossed the room and looked at it without touching it for a long moment. It was not what he'd imagined from the word ring, not jewelry in any conventional sense. The band was wide, almost thick enough to be a cuff, and made of something that wasn't quite any metal he could identify, the color shifting between gold and silver and something deeper depending on the angle. Set into the band at 4 equidistant points were 4 stones, small but extraordinarily vivid, a ruby red enough to look wet, a yellow stone the color of sunlight through honey, a blue stone so clear it seemed lit from within, and a green stone that was not emerald green but something darker, the green of deep water. And interlocking all 4 stones, carved into the metal and somehow also part of the metal, was the pattern. The covenant pattern. All 4 founders, bound together. Beside the ring on the pedestal was a single card, also cream parchment, the same architectural handwriting. The covenant ring was forged in the year 993 by Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin, in the first year of the school's life, as a promise to each other and to those who would come after. It was agreed, if the school and the principles upon which it was built were ever so fundamentally betrayed that those within it could not seek justice through ordinary means, then the ring would call a worthy heir, and the heir would be the instrument of summoning, and the founders would return to bear witness and to judge. The ring chooses. It has chosen you. To call us, place the ring on your wand hand. Speak each of our names once, clearly, without flourish. Speak the word covenant last. What follows is not magic. It is older than magic. It is a promise kept. RRRR Rowena Ravenclaw. Harry stared at the initial for a moment, processing the absurdity of having received a letter from a woman who had died 1,000 years ago, and then decided he was well past the point where absurdity could stop him. He picked up the ring. It was heavier than he expected, the warmth of it immediate and somehow different from the warmth of the stone, directed, almost intentional, like being recognized. He turned it over in his fingers, watched the 4 stones catch his wand light and throw it back changed, each stone transforming the light into its own color so that the chamber momentarily bloomed red gold blue green in slow sequence. His heart was beating faster. Not from fear, something more complicated, something in the same family as the feeling he got at the start of a Quidditch match but deeper. Something that felt like the beginning of something significant. He slid the ring onto the middle finger of his right hand. It fit perfectly. Of course it fit perfectly. He took a breath. Godric Gryffindor. The ruby flared. The warmth in his hand intensified, shooting up his arm, and the carved patterns on the walls began to glow, faint at first, then steadier, a warm gold red that turned the shadows rich and amber. The chamber felt suddenly less like a basement and more like something else. Something that had been waiting to be itself. Helga Hufflepuff. The yellow stone answered, and a scent filled the air, earth and growing things and something warm and sweet that shouldn't have made sense underground but did, completely, in a way that bypassed analysis and went straight to feeling. Harry's eyes were watering slightly and he couldn't entirely explain why. Rowena Ravenclaw. Blue light, clean and cold and brilliant, the kind of light that cleared thinking rather than warming it. The patterns on the ceiling sharpened, each line precise and almost architectural in the new illumination, and for just a moment Harry had the distinct impression that the chamber was much larger than its walls suggested, that there were depths to it that his eyes couldn't find. He paused. The last name. He'd known it was coming, had been bracing for some particular complicated feeling about it, and the complicated feeling arrived right on schedule. Slytherin. The name that had been used like a weapon against him since he was 11. The house that claimed Voldemort. The name on the locket his best friend's family had kept like an heirloom wound. But the ring was warm and the chamber was waiting and the card had said a promise kept, and Harry had spent enough of his life letting other people's prejudices dictate his reactions. He was done with that. He was done with a lot of things. Salazar Slytherin. The green stone lit up, deep and extraordinary, and the temperature in the chamber dropped about 3 degrees and then immediately steadied, not uncomfortably cold but crisp, clarified, the way air gets at high altitude. The snake in the pattern on the wall seemed to move, just barely, just a suggestion of motion, scales catching light, and then was still. All 4 stones were blazing now, throwing their individual colors out into the chamber so they overlapped and mixed in the center of the room, making a light that shouldn't have worked as a combination but was somehow harmonious, the way harmony in music works, for different things that are more together than the sum of what they were apart. Harry's voice, when it came, was steady. Covenant. The silence that followed lasted exactly 1 heartbeat. Then the chamber exhaled. There was no other word for it. The air moved outward from the center of the room in a wave that he felt in his chest and his teeth and the backs of his hands, not violent but vast, the way you feel the movement of something enormous passing nearby. The patterns on the walls blazed up to blinding and Harry threw his arm across his eyes on instinct, and then the light changed character, went from the flat brightness of raw magic to something warmer and more directed, lamplight rather than lightning, and he lowered his arm and saw them. 4 figures, standing in the 4 corners of the chamber, each in the color of their light. They were not ghosts. He understood that immediately and completely. Hogwarts ghosts were silver and translucent, their edges imprecise, their presence defined by absence rather than substance. These figures were present in the opposite way, too defined, too vivid, the kind of detail that real things have and memory doesn't. He could see the specific way Godric Gryffindor's hair caught the ruby light. He could see the laugh lines around Helga Hufflepuff's eyes and the ink stain on 2 of Rowena Ravenclaw's right fingers and the precise, considered stillness in Salazar Slytherin's posture. They were solid. Or solid adjacent. Something that the world had to acknowledge rather than allow. None of them spoke immediately. They were looking at him. All 4 of them, with a quality of attention so concentrated that Harry felt it physically, the way you feel direct sunlight. He stood his ground. Godric Gryffindor was the first to move. He was larger than Harry had imagined from portraits, broad and red-cheeked with a red-brown beard and the kind of physical presence that suggested he'd never had to claim space because space simply arranged itself around him. He stepped forward from his corner, 2 steps, looked Harry up and down with eyes that were golden hazel and startlingly perceptive, and then a slow grin broke across his face like sunrise. "Well," he said. His voice was unexpectedly rich, warm, amused in a way that immediately made Harry want to understand the joke. "There's my blood, all right. Look at that, she's got the Potter jaw and the Evans eyes and somehow it makes complete sense. She. Harry said. Your mother, boy. Lily Evans, née of the old line. You think those eyes were chance? He crossed the remaining distance in 2 large steps and clapped Harry on the shoulder, and Harry felt that too, felt the actual physical weight of it, the grip that was warm and solid and real. By Merlin, it's good to be called. Last time I got more than 5 minutes of awareness was 1943 and the context was considerably less hopeful. 1943, Rowena said from her corner, and her voice was like the blue light, clear and cool and carrying. She hadn't moved yet. She was studying Harry with the expression of someone doing very fast mathematics. The riddle boy. The chamber. She paused. A significantly less worthy summoning. The covenant did not answer fully. It answered enough to close the chamber, Helga said. Her voice was warmer than Rowena's, and she stood in her corner with a stillness that was different from Salazar's, not watchful but settled, the stillness of deep water rather than coiled readiness. She was round-faced and fair, and the sadness in her expression when her eyes moved over Harry made him want to ask what she saw. But the boy who opened it wasn't the one who summoned. It wasn't a true calling. This, Salazar said, speaking for the first time from his corner, is. Harry turned to look at him and made a conscious decision not to be unsettled by what he saw. Salazar Slytherin was tall and angular, dark-haired going silver at the temples, with a face that was more austere than cruel and eyes that were grey-green and very old. He looked nothing like Tom Riddle, which Harry had half expected and was now ashamed of having expected. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was hard to read, evaluating, yes, but something else underneath, something that might have been recognition. You are not what I would have chosen, Salazar said conversationally. He pushed off from the wall and walked to the center of the chamber, joining Godric, and the combination of their proximity made the air feel charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. You are exactly what Godric would have chosen. Which means you are, almost certainly, what is needed. He paused. I say that as a compliment. I'll take it as one, Harry said. Salazar looked at him for another moment, and then nodded, once, as if something had been confirmed. Good, Godric said, already moving back toward the pedestal, running his hand along the carved patterns in the wall with an expression of clear satisfaction. Good lad. I was worried we'd get someone who needed 20 minutes of convincing he wasn't dreaming. He glanced back at Harry. You don't think you're dreaming? I've had stranger dreams, Harry said. My dreams usually smell worse. Godric let out a bark of laughter and Helga smiled, and even Rowena's expression shifted slightly in a way that might have been amusement if it had any less dignity. We have questions, Rowena said, reclaiming the room's attention with an effortless redistribution of gravity. She finally walked toward the center of the chamber, and Harry noticed she moved like someone who'd spent decades in a library, precise, economical, purposeful, but carrying a bookweight of knowledge in every step. And I suspect you have considerably more than questions. But before anything else, she looked at Harry directly, and her gaze was the most unsettling thing in the room, not because it was hostile but because it was completely, entirely honest. Tell me one thing. Are you here because you are afraid? Or are you here because you are angry? Harry thought about it for a real moment. The honest answer, which he gave. I'm here because I'm tired of being moved around like a piece on someone else's board. The chamber went very quiet. Then Salazar said, with quiet certainty, now we are ready to begin. Outside, the afternoon light was slanting toward evening. In the village, a blackbird was singing somewhere beyond the overgrown garden wall. Harry Potter stood in a room beneath his parents' ruined house, wearing a ring that had been waiting 1,000 years for this particular moment, with the 4 founders of Hogwarts arranged around him like a constellation, and felt something he hadn't felt since before the Department of Mysteries, since before the whole terrible year of umbrage and lies and survival by the skin of his teeth. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because someone had placed him here. Not because a prophecy had guided him here. Because he had chosen it, walked here on his own 2 feet, put the ring on with his own hand, spoken the names with his own voice. "All right," he said, and his voice came out even, clear, certain in a way it hadn't sounded in a very long time. He looked at all 4 of them, one after another, and settled last on Godric, who was watching him with those bright hazel eyes full of something too layered to call pride but clearly in the same family. "Let's talk about Albus Dumbledore." The torchlight, which had appeared in the wall sconces at some point Harry hadn't noticed, burning without fuel in all 4 founder colors, seemed to burn a little steadier. Rowena said, "Yes." She said it like someone who had been waiting a very long time to say exactly that word in exactly this context. "Let us." Chapter 2, 4 voices, 1 purpose. They stayed in the chamber for the first hour. Rowena made that decision without announcing it. She simply sat down on the stone floor with the precise, unhurried movements of someone settling in for a long piece of work, arranged her robes, and looked at Harry with an expression that said talk. The others followed her lead in their own ways. Helga found a ledge along the wall and perched on it with her hands folded in her lap. Godric dropped into a cross-legged sit with the comfortable ease of a man who'd campaigned in worse conditions. Salazar remained standing but leaned against the wall, arms folded, and became very still. Harry sat on the floor in the middle of them and talked. He hadn't planned to say as much as he did. He'd intended to be efficient about it, give them the relevant information, let them assess, move forward. But there was something about being in a room with 4 people who were completely impossible to impress, who had no stake in his telling the story any particular way, who were watching him with the specific quality of attention that very old, very experienced people give to testimony they intend to use. Something about all of that loosened something in his chest that had been very tightly wound for a very long time. So he started at the beginning. Not the convenient beginning, not well it all started when Voldemort came back, but the real beginning, the cupboard under the stairs beginning, the "You're a wizard, Harry" beginning, the first time he'd stood in front of the Sorting Hat and heard a small voice say "You do well in Slytherin" and felt the specific panic of a boy who didn't yet understand what that meant and already understood it would make everything harder. He talked for a long time. Nobody interrupted him. Even Godric, who gave off the energy of someone physiologically incapable of sustained silence, watched him with his chin on his fist and said nothing while Harry talked. Helga's expression moved through things Harry couldn't entirely name, not pity, nothing as reductive as that, but a kind of fierce empathy that somehow felt more like respect. Rowena took no visible notes but had the look of someone filing everything, every detail, into a mental architecture specifically built to hold it. And Salazar's face was, for the most part, unreadable, but 3 times Harry caught something cross it that looked uncomfortably like recognition. Not of Harry specifically. Of patterns. Of the particular shape that manipulation takes when it's sophisticated enough to look like love. When Harry finished, ending with the prophecy, with the office full of broken instruments, with Sirius's name that he said once and cleanly and didn't circle back to, the chamber was quiet for a full minute. Then Godric said, "He left you with Muggles." "Yes." Deliberately. He said it was for the blood protection. "My mother's sacrifice, I know what blood protection is, boy, I helped invent the theoretical framework." Godric's voice was still warm but there was an edge under it now, steady and flat, like finding stone under topsoil. Blood protection requires proximity to the blood relative. It does not require the child to sleep in a cupboard. It does not require a decade and a half of neglect. He paused. What it does require, if your aim is something beyond protection, is isolation. A child kept away from the wizarding world, from knowledge of his own family, from anyone who might tell him who he really is or what he might really be capable of, that child arrives at school with nothing. No context. No understanding of his own power. Nothing to trust except the person who eventually tells him the story. Harry didn't say anything. He'd been thinking variations of this for weeks, feeling his way around the edges of it in the dark, but hearing it said plainly and without apology by someone with no reason to spare his feelings, that was different. "That's not proof of intent," Rowena said. She wasn't contradicting Godric, exactly, she was being precise. It is, however, a pattern that demands accounting for. It's several patterns, Salazar said from the wall, not moving, that demand accounting for. He finally pushed off from his position and walked to the center of the room, and Harry had the strange sensation that the temperature adjusted slightly with his movement, a degree cooler where he stood. Not unpleasant. Just specific. The Dursley situation is one thread. The schooling is another. The specific, persistent withholding of information about the prophecy, the Horcruxes, he stopped. He knows about the Horcruxes. He's known for some time, Rowena said quietly. Then why, Helga began, and stopped herself. She pressed her lips together. A muscle in her jaw moved. When she spoke again her voice was very controlled, which, Harry was beginning to understand, was the version of Helga Hufflepuff that other people should worry about. He knows what Voldemort made. He knows Harry will need to understand what was made if he is to undo it. And he said nothing. He said some things, Harry offered, because fairness demanded it. He's been teaching me. Showing me memories. About Riddle's past, how he grew, what made him, Salazar repeated, and the phrase landed with a particular weight in his mouth. The story of how Tom Riddle became what he is. Yes. I imagine that's an illuminating curriculum. He looked at Harry with those complicated gray-green eyes. Tell me, in all of these lessons, has he told you what you are? Not what Voldemort is, not what the prophecy demands, what you are, specifically. Your full heritage. Your actual capabilities. What the ring you're wearing now connects you to. Harry's answer was silence. Which was an answer. No, Salazar said. He would not. He's not malicious, Harry said, and was slightly surprised to find that he meant it even now, standing in this chamber, wearing this ring, having just finished saying aloud all the things he'd been refusing to look at directly for weeks. I don't think he wakes up in the morning planning to use me. I think he genuinely believes he's doing what's right. I think he loves me in his way. The four founders looked at him. Helga said, quietly and with great care, that can be true and still be monstrous, Harry. It was the first time any of them had used his name, and it hit him differently than he expected, not sentimental but grounding, like being handed something solid. I know, he said. Right then, Godric said, slapping both palms on his knees and standing up with the energy of someone who had processed things at twice the speed of ordinary people and was ready for the next stage. We're agreed. There needs to be a reckoning. Not retribution, or not only retribution, but a genuine public accounting. The school. The ministry. The systematic choices that put a child in a cupboard and called it protection and called it love. He looked at each of the others in turn. We are the founders of Hogwarts. We are not dead, or not only dead, and the school is ours as much as it is Dumbledore's. More. He looked at Harry. And Harry is ours. Flesh and blood and rightful heir, and no one told him. A trial, Rowena said. A reckoning, Godric repeated, not correcting her but insisting on the particular weight of his word. A trial, Rowena said again, in a tone that meant they were calling it a trial and that was the end of the discussion. Properly constituted. Legally constructed under magical covenant law, which predates the ministry by approximately 6 centuries and against which the ministry has no standing. We summon witnesses. We establish the court. We give Albus Dumbledore the chance to speak in his own defense, because we are not what he has been, we do not move in the dark, we do not pull strings from behind curtains. We do this in the open, before the wizarding world, so that when judgment falls it cannot be dismissed, appealed, or quietly buried. He'll fight it, Harry said. Of course he will, Salazar said, and something that was almost a smile moved across his face without quite landing. He's brilliant and he's been doing this for a very long time and he will immediately understand exactly how much danger this represents to everything he's built. The almost smile developed slightly. That is precisely why it will work. Men like Dumbledore prepare for every contingency except the one where the ground itself rises and calls them to account. Harry turned the ring on his finger, not anxiously, just feeling the weight of it, the warmth of the 4 stones in sequence. What do I need to do? First, Rowena said, rising from the floor with a fluid movement that made it look like standing up from stone was entirely comfortable, you need to understand what you are carrying. She crossed to him and held out her hand, palm up, not demanding, inviting. Harry hesitated, then extended his ring hand. She didn't touch the ring but held her palm close to it, and the blue stone lit briefly, a pulse of clear light. The Covenant ring is not a weapon. It is a court in miniature. When it is active, which it now is, and will remain until the reckoning is complete, it provides you with 3 things. She counted them on her own fingers, efficient and precise. First, access to the 4 of us. Not continuously, we are not ghosts and this is not possession, so do not concern yourself about that. But when you have need of counsel, when the ring grows warm, that is us. Pay attention to it. Second, legal standing under Covenant law. The ring grants its bearer the right to issue formal summons that cannot be magically ignored or deflected, not by Dumbledore, not by the Ministry, not by anyone. A summons issued with this ring must be answered. Third, the ring will respond to genuine threat with genuine force. It is not a wand, it doesn't require incantations or training. It requires intent. If someone tries to harm you while you carry it, the ring will respond. She met his eyes. Try not to need that. I'll do my best, Harry said. He's been doing his best for 15 years, Godric said, something fierce and fond in his voice simultaneously. Let's try doing his better. They came above ground near sunset. Harry led the way up the narrow stairs, back into the ruined kitchen, the Founders filing up behind him in a column of quiet light. In the dimming afternoon, with the shadows going long through the broken windows and the smell of old stone and overgrown garden everywhere, they looked both more real and more impossible, more present than the chamber had allowed him to appreciate. Godric ducked under a low doorway and looked around the kitchen with an expression of frank assessment. Helga went to the window and looked out at the garden with a kind of quiet attention. Rowena turned in a slow circle, examining the preservation charms on the structure. Good work on the stasis, she said, to no one in particular. Someone with considerable skill did this. Recent, too, in magical terms. Dumbledore, probably, Harry said. He preserved it after my parents died. Rowena's expression did something careful and contained. Yes. Of course he did. Salazar had gone very still in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway. Harry turned to look at him and found him staring at a spot on the hallway wall, and when Harry followed his gaze he saw what Salazar was looking at, a small framed photograph, the frame cracked but the image intact, a young woman laughing at whoever held the camera, her red hair bright even in the faded image. Young enough that Harry had never seen a photograph of her this young. But there was no possible mistake about who she was. Your mother, Salazar said. Not a question. Yeah. Salazar was quiet for another moment. Then, without any particular inflection, she was in my house's line. Did you know that? Harry looked at him. The letter said the maternal line was Gryffindor's, through Ignotus Peverell on your father's side, yes. Your mother's magic, the specific signature of it, the protection she made, that is Slytherin work. The ancient kind. He paused. Love as the deepest magic. Self-sacrifice as the most powerful ward. These things are not Gryffindor's instinct. Gryffindor's instinct is to stand in front of the threat with a sword. He glanced at Godric, who looked entirely unbothered by this characterization. What your mother did was something older and subtler. It is the magic of deep bonds and impossible costs. That is Slytherin's first school of thought, before it became, he stopped. Before it became what it became, Godric finished, without cruelty, just plainly. Yes, Salazar said. Harry looked at the photograph of his mother. He'd spent a long time thinking of her in terms of sacrifice and protection and magical mechanics, and something about Salazar's perspective, the fact that Slytherin himself was offering it, made him see her differently. Not as a martyr. As a practitioner. A very good one, doing the most extraordinary thing her particular magical instinct could reach for. He was going to have to think about that more later. Right now there were things to do. "Where do I stay tonight?" he asked, which was practical enough to pull everyone back to the present. Godric laughed, a big warm sound in the broken kitchen. "The house will hold. The stasis magic Rowena mentioned, it's environmental, keeps the structure sound. The upper floor is compromised but the ground floor will serve. There's a parlor." "You have memory of this house?" Harry asked. "We have memory of everything connected to our magic," Helga said gently, turning from the window. "The ring connects us to you, and you are connected to this place. It's not unlike remembering a dream you've been told about, the details are approximate but the shape is right." Harry nodded and went to look for the parlor. It was at the front of the house, and it was the most intact room he'd found yet. The window was whole, the floorboards were sound, and there was a fireplace that Godric lit with a gesture before Harry could reach for his wand. Harry didn't comment on the gesture. He sat in what remained of an armchair, the stuffing listing slightly to one side but the structure holding, and the Founders arranged themselves around the room in ways that he was already beginning to understand were characteristic. Godric by the fire, restless even while staying still, Helga nearby, facing the room, Rowena at the window, facing outward, Salazar somewhere behind Harry's chair, which should have felt unsettling and somehow didn't. "I need to understand the shape of this," Harry said. "The trial. What it actually looks like." "It will be held at Hogwarts," Rowena said, from the window. The last light was going behind her, the room settling into firelight. "In the Great Hall. The school is ours, we built the magic of its foundations, we are embedded in its wards as deeply as the stone. No one can prevent us from exercising authority within those walls. Dumbledore is the headmaster." "Dumbledore is a tenant," Salazar said from behind him, without heat, just stating a fact. "A very long-standing, enormously accomplished tenant. But a tenant. The Great Hall will become a court of covenant," Rowena continued. "We will set it. The magic recognizes us. It will not be a ministry trial, no dementors, no kangaroo proceedings, no one sentenced by a man who is himself in the dock." Something sharp moved across her face. "A real one. Witnesses properly called. Evidence properly presented. Dumbledore properly heard, because, and I want to be clear about this cannot be theater. If we do this as theater, as spectacle, we become the very thing we are indicting him for. He has done genuine good. He must be permitted to say so. But the genuine good does not cancel the harm, and the harm must be seen. Who decides the judgment?" Harry asked. "Is it the four of you?" "We provide the framework and the authority," Rowena said. "But covenant law requires a body of witnesses to ratify the verdict. In this case, the wizarding public. Those who attend, those who watch." She paused. "It will be witnessed by the entire world. We will ensure that." "The prophet will hate it," Harry said. "The prophet will be irrelevant," Salazar said. "The covenant summons and the covenant summons reach beyond owls and newsprint. When the formal summons is issued, everyone it touches will know it is not political. They will know it is not propaganda. The magic itself communicates that." He paused. "People may not like what they see. That is not our concern. Our concern is that they see it." Harry stared into the fire for a moment. The flames were burning in that particular shade of warm amber gold that Godric's presence seemed to bring to fire, and the room despite everything had a quality that felt almost, not comfortable, not exactly, but like a version of comfort that had been waiting for him to need it. "He's going to be hurt," Harry said. "Dumbledore. Not physically. But this is it's going to undo things for him." "Yes," Helga said. Simply, without apology. He's the reason Voldemort hasn't won yet. He's been the main opposition for 20 years. He has, Helga agreed. And we are not saying he has not done necessary things, or done them with courage. We are saying that the way he has done them has cost too much, paid in currency that wasn't his to spend. Your year of imprisonment, under that woman, her voice changed, briefly, over the word woman, something that made Harry quite glad he was not Dolores Umbridge, your friend Longbottom, who has been carrying his family's tragedy without proper support or knowledge since he was a small child, the Weasley family, used repeatedly as pawns in games they weren't fully informed about. These are not abstract policy costs. These are children. He would say the alternative was worse, Harry said. He would be right, Rowena said. And that is precisely why this needs to be a real trial and not a lynching. Because he would be right, partially, and that partial rightness is the most dangerous thing about him. She turned from the window, and in the firelight her face was very serious and very clear. A man who is entirely wrong is easy to oppose. A man who is 60% right and uses that 60% to justify the other 40, that is the man who does the most lasting damage to institutions, to trust, to the ability of people to know what is actually true. 60%, Harry said. I am being generous, Rowena said. He may be as high as 75. Godric snorted from by the fire. The point stands, she said, unruffled. Harry leaned back in the armchair, the stuffing shifting under him, and looked at the ceiling, where the plaster had cracked in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. He thought about everything he'd said in the chamber, all of it, the long unspooling of 15 years of history, and he thought about the way all four of them had listened, not with the performance of listening, not as advisors preparing their counter-advice, but actually listened, actually received it. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. Maybe Sirius. Maybe, in his own rough way, Sirius had been the last person who listened to him that way. He pressed the heel of his hand against the ring and felt the warmth of all four stones in sequence, steady and present. I need to write letters, he said. Ron and Hermione. They need to know what's happening before the summons go out. Yes, Godric said, straightforward about it. You should not go into this without them. Hermione will have opinions about the legal framework, Rowena said, and something moved in her expression that Harry could only identify as anticipatory. I look forward to her opinions about the legal framework. Ron will worry about his family, Harry said. His parents are in the Order. They're Dumbledore's people. They are also adults who deserve the chance to make an informed choice, Helga said. That is rather the whole point. Harry nodded. He found parchment and a quill in what had been his father's writing desk, the desk having survived in the parlor with less damage than almost anything else in the house. He suspected the Founders had something to do with the parchment's survivability, but didn't ask. He wrote to Ron first, short, specific, I've found something important and I need you to come to Godric's Hollow as soon as you can, don't tell Dumbledore, trust me, and then to Hermione, which was longer because she would want context and he gave her what he could in 3 careful paragraphs. He sealed both with Hedwig, who had been waiting on the window ledge with the patience of someone who'd known her services would be required and was mildly irritated it had taken this long to be asked. Now, he said, watching Hedwig disappear into the darkening sky. Tell me about the summons. How they work. What they do. Rowena settled into the other chair, his mother's chair, probably, the one across the fireplace, smaller and more worn than his father's, and leaned forward with her elbows on her knees, which was a posture so unlike how Harry had imagined Rowena Ravenclaw sitting that it made him like her more than he already did. The formal summons under covenant law, she said, is a document. I will draft it. It requires the bearer's intent and the ring seal, and when it is dispatched it cannot be stopped, cannot be intercepted, cannot be destroyed before the recipient reads it. It arrives. It is read. It is understood. She paused. The summons will go to Albus Dumbledore. To Cornelius Fudge as acting minister, and to his successor if Fudge falls before the trial convenes, the ministry must be formally served regardless of who holds the office. To the Hogwarts Board of Governors, all 12 members. To Dolores Umbridge personally. Why Umbridge? Harry asked. Because she is not Dumbledore's responsibility at the trial, Rowena said. She is separately accountable. What she did to students, what she did to you specifically, was her choice, not his instruction. She must answer for it separately. Harry thought about the blood quill. The back of his right hand, where the words had faded but his body remembered the carving of them. I must not tell lies. Over and over. All right, he said, and his voice was perfectly even. There are others we will want to call as witnesses for your case, Rowena continued. The Longbottom boy. Luna Lovegood, she was detained by Umbridge's inquisitorial squad, yes. More than detained, Harry said. Yes. I thought so. A pause. Ginevra Weasley was possessed by the Riddle Diary in her first year at the school. She will have testimony relevant to the questions of what was known and when. Harry thought about Ginny, the small, white-faced girl he remembered from second year, who'd grown into someone as sharp and sure as a blade. She'd never really talked about the diary possession, not with him, and he'd never pushed it. He wasn't sure how she'd feel about being asked to testify. He suspected she'd say yes immediately and that the testimony would be devastating. What about Neville's parents, he asked. The room went quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet, but a weighted one. That is a conversation that needs to happen between you and Neville before it becomes part of any legal proceeding, Helga said carefully. His parents' situation, what was done to them, and what was known, touches on things that are his to decide. He'll say yes, Harry said. He's braver than people know. Most people are braver than people know, Helga said. That is almost always true, and almost always overlooked. The fire had burned down to comfortable coals by the time they'd covered the main shape of the plan, the broad structure of how the next few weeks would go, what needed to happen before the Covenant Court could be properly convened. Harry had asked questions, a lot of them, because the plan had layers and each layer raised new questions, and the founders had answered with a consistency and a coherence that told him they'd had a long time to think about what justice should look like and were now, for the first time, in a position to make it actual. At one point, deep into the discussion of legal procedure, Godric had stretched out fully on the floor with his hands behind his head and stared at the ceiling, and Harry had looked at him with some uncertainty about whether this was a sign of boredom, and Godric had said, without moving, I'm listening. I always think better horizontal, and Salazar had said, from the shadows by the door, that is a lie he has been telling for 1,000 years, and Godric had grinned at the ceiling and said, and 1,000 years of success recommends it, and Helga had laughed, and something in the room shifted from purposeful to human, briefly, in a way that made Harry understand that these four people had known each other longer than most civilizations had existed and had, against considerable odds, remained genuinely fond of each other. He thought about that. What it meant to build something together and watch what happened to it over 1,000 years and come back and find it compromised in specific, recognizable ways. Can I ask you something? He said, late in the evening, the fire down to embers. You've been asking things for 3 hours, Godric said comfortably, still on the floor. About the school itself. When you built it, what was it supposed to be? Not philosophically. Practically. What did you actually want it to do? The room considered this question as if it deserved to be considered. It was Helga who answered, and the simplicity of her answer was the thing that made it land. We wanted a place where every magical child in Britain could come and be safe and be taught and be known. Not known as their family's heir or their house's representative or the prophecy's subject. Known as themselves. Known as themselves, Harry repeated. Yes, she said. And educated. Not just in spells and potions, but in the actual nature of magic, what it is, where it comes from, why the choices you make about it matter. We wanted them to leave knowing things. She paused. Knowing who they were, specifically. Knowing what they were capable of. A direct look at Harry. The way you did not know, when you arrived. Harry looked at the ring on his hand. In the low ember light the 4 stones were barely glowing, just a warm suggestion of their true brightness, pulsing slowly in a rhythm that he'd stopped noticing consciously about an hour ago and was now aware of the way you're aware of your own heartbeat when someone mentions it. "We're going to build it back," he said. Not a question. Not a plan, not yet, something earlier and more fundamental than a plan. A decision. "The trial first," Rowena said, gently but firmly. "The trial first," Harry agreed. "And then we're going to build it back." Outside, the summer dark had fully settled over Godric's Hollow. The blackbird had stopped singing hours ago. The ruined house was quiet except for the low voices of the living and the very nearly living, making plans in the ember light, and upstairs through the collapsed roof the stars were completely visible, all of them, more than you could see from any city, the whole ridiculous magnificent abundance of them spread out over the broken walls of the place where everything had started. Harry fell asleep in his father's armchair sometime after midnight, still wearing the ring, and dreamed of nothing in particular, which was the best sleep he'd had in 3 weeks. Chapter 3, The Summons. Ron arrived first. He came by flow, which meant someone had connected the ruined house's fireplace to the network. Harry suspected Godric, who had an unexplained talent for infrastructure and the expression of a man who found bureaucratic magical systems mildly beneath his concern. Ron stepped out of the hearth at 7 in the morning trailing soot and carrying a rucksack that clinked with what sounded like a hastily packed combination of clothes and food, and he took exactly 3 seconds to register the state of the house before deciding it wasn't the priority. "You're all right," he said, looking at Harry. "I'm all right," Harry confirmed. "Your letter said don't tell Dumbledore, so I didn't tell Dumbledore, but Mum noticed I was packing and I told her I was going to Fred and George's and she definitely didn't believe me, but she let me go, which means she's either very distracted or she knows more than she said, which," he stopped. He'd looked past Harry into the parlor and registered, in sequence, Godric sitting on the windowsill, Helga by the fireplace, Rowena at the desk with parchment in front of her, and Salazar standing in the corner. Ron's mouth opened and then closed again. His ears went, by visible degrees, from their normal color through pink to a red that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the specific biological response to being in the presence of the impossible. "Ron," Harry said. "These are the founders of Hogwarts." "A beat." "Right," Ron said. "All 4 of them." Yeah. Ron's eyes moved through the room again, slower this time. His gaze snagged on Salazar and stayed there for a moment with the specific intensity of a Weasley making a decision about trust in real time. Then he seemed to resolve something internally, squared his shoulders, and turned back to Harry. "So what's the plan?" Harry loved Ron Weasley more in that moment than he had words for. "Sit down," Harry said. "We'll explain." They did, the 5 of them together, the founders taking turns where their particular expertise was relevant, Harry filling in the human detail, Ron asking questions that cut to the practical heart of things in ways that made Godric look at him with immediate appreciation. Ron was not, as people tended to assume, unequal to the extraordinary. He was simply ordinary in the way that only genuinely brave people could afford to be. He'd lived alongside the extraordinary long enough that his response to it was less "this is impossible" and more "right, how do we handle it?" He had 2 moments of real struggle. The first was when Rowena laid out the scope of Dumbledore's accountability, the full list of documented decisions and their consequences, and Ron went very quiet in the way that meant he was working against something he didn't want to feel. The Weasleys loved Dumbledore. Not blindly, Ron was too honest with himself for blind faith, but genuinely, with the specific loyalty of a family that had been in the fight for a long time and knew who had been fighting alongside them. Hearing the case made against a man he loved was hard, and Harry watched him sit with it rather than deflect, which was its own kind of courage. The second was when Harry mentioned Ginny. "She'll need to be asked properly," Ron said. His voice was careful. "Not told. Asked." "I know," Harry said. "And if she says no, then she says no." Ron nodded. He seemed satisfied with that. "She'll say yes," he said, echoing Harry's words about Neville from the night before without knowing it, and Harry didn't point that out. Hermione arrived 2 hours later, and her arrival was a different event entirely. She came by owl-redirected portkey, which she had apparently constructed herself in the 2 hours between receiving Harry's letter and arriving, which told Harry everything about the state of her mind regarding the situation. She appeared in the center of the parlor with a small crack and a stack of books under one arm that she had clearly grabbed on instinct, and she looked at Harry, and then at the ring, and then at the 4 founders, and then back at Harry, and her expression did something very complex and very Hermione. A rapid layering of academic excitement and emotional concern and fierce protectiveness and the particular quality of attention she brought to problems she considered genuinely serious. "Harry," she said. "Tell me everything." She listened to the whole story a second time, Harry giving her the version he'd given Ron, the founders adding what they'd added before, and she listened the way Rowena listened, which Harry noticed and which, looking at them both, made a kind of obvious sense. Rowena watched Hermione with an expression of open interest. Hermione appeared to be trying very hard not to openly stare at Rowena Ravenclaw and failing at intervals. When it was done, Hermione asked 14 questions, 11 of which were about legal procedure and 3 of which were about Harry's well-being, and she asked the well-being questions with the same precision and seriousness she brought to the legal ones, which was also very Hermione. Rowena answered the legal questions in detail. On question 7, which concerned the jurisdictional standing of covenant law relative to the 1692 International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy, Rowena said something in dense legalese that Harry didn't entirely follow and Hermione responded in kind and they went back and forth for 4 minutes at a pace and a vocabulary level that excluded everyone else in the room. Godric watched it with great enjoyment. "I like her," he said to Harry, in a carrying undertone. "I know," Harry said. "You should," Godric began. "Godric," Salazar said, without emphasis. Godric subsided, still looking pleased. When Hermione and Rowena eventually surfaced from their exchange, Hermione had the expression of someone who has found something extraordinary in the back of a library and is working very hard to remain composed about it. Rowena had the expression of someone who has just had a good conversation for the first time in several centuries. "The framework is sound," Hermione said, turning to Harry. "Better than sound, actually. The covenant law predates almost everything, it's genuinely bulletproof. The ministry can't touch it. No one can touch it." She paused. "Which means when this happens, it's going to be, there's no procedural escape hatch. No one can claim the trial was invalid." "That's the intention," Rowena said. "And the summons go out when?" "Today," Harry said. Hermione's eyes went to the parchment on the desk, where Rowena had been working since before Ron arrived. "I want to read them before they go." "You can read them after," Rowena said pleasantly, in the tone of someone who was not actually offering a negotiation. Hermione opened her mouth, looked at Rowena's expression, and closed it again. "After," she agreed. The summons took the rest of the morning to complete. Rowena worked with a speed and precision that made even Hermione quiet, the quill moving across parchment in that architectural hand, each document distinct. The summons to Dumbledore was different in weight and structure from the one to Fudge, different again from the one to Umbridge, specific in ways that Harry began to understand as he watched, tailored not just to the recipient's offenses but to the particular register of authority they would most recognize and least be able to dismiss. Rowena understood, deeply, that a summons was most effective when it spoke the language of the person it summoned. The summons to Dumbledore was written in the old tongue of magical covenant, the formal syntax of the school's original founding documents. If Dumbledore understood anything in the world it was Hogwarts, and this document would speak to him as a message from the school's own foundation. The summons to Fudge was written in ministry procedural language, technically perfect, structured so that every bureaucratic defense he might reach for was preemptively addressed. He could not claim jurisdiction. He could not claim prior authority. He could not claim the matter was already settled. Every door was closed before he could find it. The summons to Umbridge was shorter. It was written in plain, clear English, and its plainness was more terrible than legalese would have been. Harry watched Rowena write it and felt a cold satisfaction that was probably not his best quality and which he examined honestly and decided he was comfortable with. The Board of Governors' summons were 12 identical documents, formal and precise. The delivery of those, Rowena explained, would be simultaneous and would carry a second piece of magic embedded in the seal, an accountability charm, old as the school, that meant each governor would experience a clear and visceral awareness of their own conduct relative to the school in the moment they broke the seal. "Is that legal?" Hermione asked, reading over Rowena's shoulder. "I wrote the original accountability charms," Rowena said, not looking up. "I decide what they are." Hermione considered this for a moment. "Fair enough," she said. By midday, the documents were complete. 12 for the board, 1 each for Dumbledore, Fudge, and Umbridge. 17 summons, each sealed with the Covenant seal, the ring pressed into wax that hardened in seconds to something harder than wax had any right to be, the 4 creature emblems stamped clean and permanent. Harry held the final sealed summons and felt the stack of them in his hands, the specific weight of 17 promises. "How do they go?" Ron asked. He'd been helpful all morning in the way that Ron was specifically helpful, practical, unobtrusive, providing food from his rucksack at intervals and asking the right simple question at the right moment to break through the complexity and find the actual core of what was being discussed. "They need to go all at once," Rowena said. Staggered delivery would give the recipients time to coordinate a response before everyone had been served. Simultaneous delivery means the first response any one of them makes will be without the benefit of knowing what the others have received. "So 17 owls at the same moment," Ron said. "We don't have 17 owls," Harry said. "You have one very exceptional owl," Godric said, looking at where Hedwig sat on the back of an armchair, watching the proceedings with amber-eyed composure. "And 4 very motivated founders." He paused. "I haven't done a good Patronus class projection in 6 centuries. I am genuinely looking forward to this." "You're going to carry the summons?" Hermione asked, looking between the founders. "The Covenant can take forms beyond the ring," Helga said. "For delivery of summons, we can project, not fully manifest, as we are here, but enough. Enough to ensure the documents arrive and are received and are unmistakably understood for what they are." She folded her hands. "There is something to be said for having the founders personally deliver the documents. Cornelius Fudge, for example, is a man whose convictions are closely tied to spectacle. Receiving a Covenant summons from Helga Hufflepuff in his office will make a more lasting impression than receiving one by owl." "I want to see that," Ron said. "You will," Godric said, grinning. "We'll do it from here. The projections travel independently." It took another hour to prepare. The founders needed to establish the projection channels, which involved a ritual Harry couldn't follow precisely but which involved all 4 of them standing at the cardinal points of the parlor and the ring on Harry's hand burning steadily warm through the whole process, like an engine running at full capacity. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat against the wall and watched and had the shared experience of witnessing something genuinely ancient operate at full power in a ruined kitchen in the English countryside. "I'm going to need to write this down later," Hermione murmured. "Write it down now," Ron suggested, pulling a Muggle biro from his rucksack and offering it to her. She took it without looking, already reaching for parchment. At 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday in mid-July, 17 summons went out simultaneously. Hedwig carried Dumbledore's. She left the window with the sealed roll in her talons and flew with particular authority, and Harry watched her go with the feeling of something irrevocable beginning, which was the right feeling for the moment. The founders projected in sequence, brief and brilliant, each one a flash of the room's temperature and light shifting as one of them sent part of themselves outward across the distance. Godric went first, stretching toward London with a burst of warmth and amber light. Then Helga, something greener and more grounded traveling south toward Fudge's country residence. Rowena, cool and blue, splitting into 12 equal parts for the 12 board members with a precision that made Hermione actually gasp. And finally Salazar, last and quietest, sending something dark and deliberate toward wherever Umbridge had retreated after her removal from Hogwarts. They all came back to themselves within 30 seconds. And then they waited. It didn't take long. The first response came from Fudge. A Ministry Owl, Red Bandit Priority Post, arrived less than 40 minutes after the projections went out. Harry broke the seal and read the letter with Ron and Hermione reading over his shoulder, and the letter was magnificent in its particular genre of political self-delusion. It began with a formal acknowledgement of receipt, moved through 3 paragraphs of bureaucratic language designed to sound authoritative while saying nothing, and ended with an instruction that Harry present himself at the Ministry at his earliest convenience to discuss the matter of this document with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, at which point the relevant authorities will determine whether the described proceedings fall within the purview of current wizarding law. He thinks he can assess whether it's valid, Hermione said. He thinks he can do a lot of things, Salazar said. Does the summons give him any actual grounds to do that? Harry asked Rowena. None, Rowena said. He has received the summons, which means the Covenant has already taken jurisdiction. His assessment of whether it falls within current wizarding law is like a landlord assessing whether gravity falls within his rental agreement. Should I respond? Harry asked. No, she said. Responding to that letter would imply he is standing to request a response. He does not. He's going to send more letters, Ron said. Almost certainly. And Aurors, Hermione added, because she was Hermione and was already 3 steps ahead. When he realizes the letters aren't working. The house is protected, Godric said, and something shifted in his expression, not threatening, not aggressive, but the specific quality of a man who had built magical defenses for a living and was now casually noting that the ones he'd layered around the house since his arrival would make any ministry intervention a memorable educational experience. They won't be able to approach it with hostile intent. Any Aurors sent here will walk up the lane, feel the ward edge, and stop. Will they be hurt? Hermione asked, with the particular caution of a person who wants to make sure justice and harm are not becoming the same thing. No, Godric said. Stopped. There's a difference. He looked at her steadily. We know the difference, Miss Granger. We have always known it. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. The second response was more significant. It came not by owl but by fire, the parlor hearth flaring green at 3:30, and Harry reflexively stood as McGonagall's head appeared in the flames. She looked like a woman who had been having a very difficult day since approximately 2 in the afternoon and expected it to continue getting more difficult for the foreseeable future. Potter, she said. Her eyes swept the room behind him, registered the Founders, and something extraordinary happened to her face, a journey from shock through disbelief through a kind of stricken recognition, like a woman watching a mathematical proof complete itself in real time and discovering the answer was both more and less than she'd hoped. She settled on Godric first, for the longest moment, and Godric looked back at her with open warmth, and something in McGonagall's posture changed, slightly, involuntarily. Professor, Harry said. The headmaster, she said carefully, has received some kind of document. He has been in his office for the past hour and a half and has declined to tell me what it contains, which means it is either extremely good news or extremely bad news, and given that I have spent this same hour and a half fielding fluke calls from 6 members of the Board of Governors, I am operating on the assumption that it is the latter. She paused. The board members are, one of them actually cried. Not from sadness. I'm not sure what from. The accountability charm, Rowena said, from across the room. McGonagall's eyes moved to Rowena. The journey this time was shorter, she'd had a moment to adjust, but no less impactful. You are, she said, slowly, Rowena Ravenclaw. I am, Rowena confirmed. And the others, all 4 of us, Helga said gently. Hello, Minerva. The use of her first name clearly hit McGonagall somewhere unguarded. She pressed her lips together. She breathed carefully through her nose. She turned her eyes back to Harry, and when she spoke her voice was completely steady, which Harry recognized as a form of extraordinary effort. Are you safe? She asked. Yes. Are you you doing this of your own free will? No coercion, no, I need to know that before anything else. My own free will, Harry said. Completely. A pause. The headmaster will want to speak with you. I know, Harry said. He'll get his chance. That's the whole point. Another pause, longer. McGonagall was very still in the fire, and Harry could see her working through something, loyalty and law and love and the specific, grinding difficulty of a person who is genuinely good, discovering that goodness and loyalty are pointing in different directions. I've known him for 40 years, she said. Not as an argument. As a statement of fact that she was laying down carefully, so she could look at it. I know, Harry said. He is not, whatever is in that document, he is not a wicked man, Potter. I know that too, Harry said. And then, because he meant it and she deserved to hear it from him directly, this isn't about calling him wicked, Professor. It's about calling him accountable. Those are different things. The fire crackled. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment with an expression he'd never quite seen on her face before, not the brisk affection of his favorite teacher, not the formal authority of a deputy headmistress, but something older and more personal, the expression of a woman who has taught a student for 5 years and is seeing, for the first time, the person they've actually become. Yes, she said at last. I suppose they are. A breath. I'll need to know the date. For whatever this is. A Covenant Court, Rowena said. Convening in 3 weeks. At Hogwarts. At Hogwarts, McGonagall repeated. It is our school, Rowena said, not unkindly. We built it. The wards know us. The Great Hall will accommodate the court at our direction. And you cannot be stopped, McGonagall said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite acceptance either, it was a woman doing a precise inventory of the situation. No, Rowena said. We cannot be stopped. And we would ask you, not require, ask, to be there. Not as a defendant. As a witness. As someone who has seen more of this institution's recent history than almost anyone alive. The fire hissed. Outside the window a car passed on the lane, very ordinary, trailing its small ordinary noise. I'll be there, McGonagall said. She pulled back slightly, then stopped. Potter. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. There are things I should have done differently. She stopped herself before she could qualify it into meaninglessness. I'm sorry. Harry had not been expecting that, and it got under his composure more effectively than almost anything else that had happened today. He kept his face level. Thank you, he said. The fire went normal-colored. She was gone. Ron let out a long slow breath. Hermione had stopped writing at some point during the Floo call and was looking at the empty fireplace with wet eyes that she appeared to be pretending weren't wet. Godric, Harry noticed, was looking at the fire with an expression of considerable satisfaction. She'll testify honestly, he said. That woman is constitutionally incapable of anything else. It'll cost her, Helga said quietly. She knows that. It costs everyone to be honest when the comfortable thing is not to be, Helga said. That is precisely why it counts. The third response came at dusk. It wasn't a letter or a Floo call or an owl. It came as a pulse of magic through the ring, not warm like the Founder's presence, but a different quality, from outside, something directed at Harry specifically. He felt it in the ring and straightened in his chair. What is that? He asked. He's trying to reach you, Rowena said. Her voice was neutral, clinical, the voice she used when she was being very precise about something that required precision. Dumbledore. Not by conventional means. He's attempting to use the connection established through your occlumency training and his own considerable skill to, essentially, to knock on the door. Can he get in? Not while you hold the ring. The ring blocks unsanctioned magical access to the bearer. She paused. He knows it. He will understand immediately why the attempt failed. Which means he knows I have the ring, Harry said. Yes. How does he feel about that? Ron asked, looking between Harry and Rowena. Worried, Salazar said, and his voice held something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sympathy, something in between, the feeling of a man watching a very complex situation develop exactly as expected and finding this more melancholy than gratifying. The pulse came again. Stronger this time. Then a third time, and the third was different, not a probe but a message, somehow, a feeling rather than a thought, and the feeling was unmistakably Dumbledore's emotional register, please. Harry sat with that for a moment. The word please from Albus Dumbledore, pressed through old magical channels against the ring's ward, landing in Harry's chest with all its weight. He thought about the office full of broken instruments. He thought about the prophecy. He thought about a very small boy in a cupboard under the stairs. He pressed his palm flat over the ring and felt the ward hold, steady and certain. He'll have his chance to speak, Harry said aloud, as much to the empty air as to the people in the room. 3 weeks. He'll have his chance. The pulse didn't come again. The evening settled over Godric's Hollow in gradations of blue and gold, and in the parlor of the ruined house Harry Potter sat with his 2 best friends and 4 people who had been dead for 1,000 years and ate the sandwiches Ron had brought in his rucksack and talked, not about the trial for once but about ordinary things. Ron made Godric describe a 1,000-year-old Quidditch match and Godric obliged with enormous enthusiasm and increasingly implausible embellishment, and Hermione asked Rowena 3 questions about original arithmetic theory, and Helga told a story about the founding of the kitchens at Hogwarts that turned out to involve a bet and a goat that Harry suspected had been embellished over the centuries but was extremely funny regardless. And Salazar, who had been quiet most of the evening, said something near the end of it that Harry turned over in his mind for a long time afterward. They'd been talking about the trial structure, briefly, and the question of public perception had come up. Would people believe the founders were real? Would people accept the court's authority? Would Wizarding Britain, with its specific cultural relationship with authority and its deeply ingrained tendency to trust the familiar over the true, actually receive what was about to happen? People follow power, Salazar had said, in that even voice. Not always, and not without complication, but fundamentally. And power comes in different forms. He'd looked at Harry. There is the power of position, Dumbledore has this, Fudge has this, and it is brittle, because positions are held by the goodwill of systems and systems can be challenged. And there is the power of being genuinely, undeniably right. He'd paused. You are right. The case you are making is correct. People will resist it, because being right about something means being wrong about something you previously believed, and humans do not enjoy that. But in the end, truth has a specific gravity, and people feel it even when they don't want to. You sound like you've watched that dynamic play out before, Harry said. I have watched it play out for 1,000 years, Salazar said. I was on the wrong side of it, once. He said it without theatrics. Just placed it on the table and left it there. I know what it looks like when someone uses position to overcome truth. I know how long it works and what it costs when it stops working. He looked at Harry. Dumbledore is not me. He is better than I was, in many important ways. But he is doing a version of what I did. And I am no longer willing to be on that side of the argument. The fire had burned low. Ron was asleep in the other armchair, his mouth slightly open, soft snoring filling the quiet. Hermione had fallen asleep at the desk with her cheek on a piece of parchment, one hand still curled around the Muggle biro. Godric had at some point migrated from the floor to sitting against the wall with his knees up, and he was watching the fire with an expression of comfortable belonging, as though a ruined house in the English countryside was as natural a place to spend an evening as any castle he'd built. Helga had blown out the extra candles earlier. The room was warm and dark and quiet. Harry sat in his father's chair and turned the ring on his finger and thought about gravity. About truth having weight. About what happened when you stopped trying to be light enough not to disturb anything and started being exactly as heavy as you were. In 3 weeks, the wizarding world was going to find out what he actually weighed. He was looking forward to it. Chapter 4, Old Magic, New Stage. The owls started arriving the next morning before breakfast. Not just from the ministry, from everywhere. From wizarding families across Britain who had felt the Covenant summons ripple through the magical community like a stone dropped in still water, not hitting them directly but disturbing something adjacent, some background frequency of shared magical awareness that the wizarding world carried collectively and rarely paid conscious attention to. They'd felt something. They didn't know what, precisely, but they'd felt it, and the letters that arrived were a spectrum of that feeling rendered in ink, some alarmed, some curious, some hostile, some written in the shaky handwriting of people who'd been woken from sleep by a sensation they couldn't identify and needed to know if anyone else had felt it too. Hermione sorted them with the systematic focus of someone who had found a useful task and was grateful for it. 3 categories, she said, stacking parchment in separate piles on the kitchen table: supportive, hostile, and uncertain. The uncertain pile was by far the largest. "That's the one that matters," Salazar said, glancing at it from the doorway with his morning cup of something that looked like tea but smelled more complicated. "The decided minds on either side will not move. The uncertain ones are the audience." "We're not performing for an audience," Hermione said, with a slight edge. "We are performing for the entire wizarding world," Salazar said, not unkindly. "I say that not as a criticism of our purpose but as a description of our reality. The trial's legitimacy lives or dies in the minds of people who don't yet know what to think. Understanding that is not cynicism. It is strategy." Hermione pressed her lips together and sorted another letter into the uncertain pile without responding, which Harry recognized as her way of conceding a point she didn't enjoy conceding. Ron came downstairs with his hair going 6 directions and a look of someone who had slept deeply and well and was mildly surprised by it. He took the hostile pile and read through it with a growing expression of incredulous amusement. "This one says you're a dark wizard," he told Harry. "This one says the Founders are obviously polyjuiced imposters. This one," he squinted, "I can't actually read this one, the person was shaking too much when they wrote it." "Put it in the uncertain pile," Harry said. "Shaking too much is uncertain. Fear usually is." Ron considered this and moved the letter. They spent the morning preparing. There was a practical list as long as Harry's arm: people to contact, arrangements to make, the specific question of how to get Neville to Godric's Hollow without alerting Dumbledore, who Harry had no doubt was now monitoring owl traffic in and out of the school and every order-safe house with the particular comprehensive thoroughness of a man who understood information as a form of power. Getting around Dumbledore's surveillance was, as Hermione pointed out, a problem that required thinking like Dumbledore. "Which means thinking about every possible route and closing each one in sequence," she said, spread-eagled on the parlor floor surrounded by parchment. "Or," Godric said, leaning in the doorway, "thinking unlike Dumbledore. Which means thinking like someone who isn't interested in subtlety." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Harry asked. "Walk directly past his surveillance," Godric said. "The ring. When you move under Covenant authority, you move outside the reach of any individual wizard's tracking charms. Dumbledore can no more follow your magical signature while you hold the ring than he can follow a fish that's left the water." Rowena looked up from her own parchment. Imprecise metaphor, but accurate in substance. She looked at Harry. "He's right. Move openly. Don't sneak. Sneaking implies you believe he has authority over your movements. He does not." Harry stood up and put his jacket on. "Where are you going?" Hermione asked. "To get Neville," Harry said. He took Ron with him because Ron knew where the Longbottoms' house was and because going alone felt like the wrong instinct, not from fear, but because this particular visit needed a witness. Neville's situation wasn't just testimony to be gathered. It was the kind of thing that needed company to carry. The Longbottom house was in Yorkshire, and they travelled by apparition. Harry had earned his license the previous term despite the Ministry's attempts to make his life difficult, arriving at the edge of a property that was larger and more manicured than Harry had imagined, surrounded by a garden that spoke of generations of careful attention. There were roses everywhere, all colors, blooming with an abundance that felt almost defiant. Someone in that house loved growing things. Neville answered the door himself. He'd grown over the year. Harry had noticed it vaguely at school but hadn't really looked. Neville was taller now, and his face had lost the soft round quality of his earlier years, settling into something squarer and more definite. He was wearing gardening gloves and there was soil on his forearm, and when he opened the door and saw Harry and Ron he had a single second of the old Neville expression, the wide-eyed uncertain one, and then something shifted behind his eyes and the expression that replaced it was different. Quieter. More certain. Less like someone expecting to be wrong and more like someone who has spent enough time being right about important things that he stopped apologizing for it. "Thought you might come," he said. "You felt it?" Harry asked. "The Covenant pulse." "Something," Neville said. He looked at the ring. His eyes stayed on it for a moment. "Yeah. I felt something." He pulled off his gardening gloves and tucked them in his back pocket. "Come in. I'll put the kettle on." His grandmother was not at home, which Neville mentioned with a look that suggested this was fortunate timing and possibly not entirely accidental. They sat in a kitchen that smelled of dried herbs and old wood and Neville made tea with the efficient habit of someone who did it often, and Harry told him. He told him everything, the same way he'd told Ron and Hermione, but there was a moment partway through where Neville's hands went very still around his mug and Harry stopped, because Neville had gone to a particular place in his face, a private place, and it needed to be respected. It was when Harry mentioned the trial's scope. The question of institutional neglect. The question of children sacrificed on the altar of a greater good without sufficient care for what the sacrifice was actually costing them. Neville looked at his tea. "My parents," he said. "We don't have to, you don't have to be involved in this part of it," Harry said carefully. "The trial doesn't require, I know it doesn't require," Neville said. His voice was steady. Not performatively steady, just actually, the stability of someone who has had to live with something terrible for long enough that the terror has compressed into something more manageable, like coal into diamond. But it should include it. Shouldn't it? What happened to them, what Dumbledore knew about Voldemort going after Aurors, the specific threats he knew about and the specific people he didn't adequately protect, he stopped. Did he know they were targets? Specifically? Harry looked at Ron, who looked back with an expression that meant "Don't look at me, this is yours." Harry turned back to Neville. "I don't know for certain," he said. "But the Founders think the evidence suggests he had sufficient intelligence to have warned specific high-risk Order members and didn't." A pause. "That's part of what the trial is for. To find out for certain." Neville nodded slowly. "I want to testify," he said. "Not for me. For them." He looked up from his tea, and his eyes were clear. "They can't say it themselves. So someone needs to say it for them." Harry thought about Sirius, falling through a curtain. About things that couldn't be said by the people who most needed to say them. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly." They came back to Godric's Hollow by late afternoon to find the house had changed while they were gone. Not dramatically, not structurally, but in the way a room changes when several people have been in it doing significant things for several hours. Hermione had covered every surface in the parlor with organized parchment. The letters had been sorted and resorted into a more nuanced taxonomy that now occupied a section of the kitchen table with small labels written in her handwriting. And in the center of it all, Rowena and Helga were bent over a large piece of parchment spread on the floor, and Harry could see from the doorway that it was a diagram of the Hogwarts Great Hall. Not a floor plan. Something more complex than a floor plan, an architectural schema of the room's magical infrastructure, the wards and channels and load-bearing enchantments that had been built into the stone over 1,000 years, annotated in Rowena's handwriting with what appeared to be instructions for a significant reconfiguration. "Are you redesigning the Great Hall?" Ron asked, stepping over a pile of parchment to peer at the diagram. "Restoring it," Rowena said, without looking up. The room was built with a particular dual function. Most of its magical range has been suppressed through disuse. She tapped a section of the diagram. The ceiling, for instance. Everyone knows it reflects the sky. What they don't know is that it also records. Everything spoken with sincere authority in that room imprints into the enchantment. It was built as a testimony hall, not just for meals and ceremonies but for exactly this kind of proceeding. She finally looked up. Dumbledore has not used that function. Which means 15 years of his tenure are not imprinted. But everything before is there. 1,000 years of this school's true record, held in the ceiling. The room went quiet for a moment in the way it did when someone said something whose implications took a few seconds to unfold. The ceiling can testify, Hermione said slowly. In a manner of speaking, Rowena said. That's extraordinary, Hermione breathed. It was intended to be, Rowena said simply. Godric came in from the garden, he'd apparently been outside, which Harry realized had become a habit, the man drawn to open space the way water was drawn to level ground, carrying something in his hand. He held it up. A small stone, pale gray, shaped roughly like an arrowhead. The wardstone's still active, he said, sounding pleased. The one I laid at the corner of the lot when your parents' house was built. Or rebuilt, I should say, there was a structure here before. James Potter's family. Going back. He looked at Harry. The ward I built is keyed to Potter blood. It's why the place has held. He turned the stone over in his fingers with the particular affection of a craftsman examining old work. Strong. Cleaner than most of what I see these days. Magic is different now. Less, earthy. Earthy? Harry said. Raw, Godric said, considering. When we built Hogwarts, magic was still, it was more connected to the physical world. To stone and ground and living things. Now it's more procedural. More technical. He wasn't complaining, exactly. Observing. Your generation does extraordinary things with it. Precision your century has that ours didn't. But you've lost something in the exchange. He looked at Harry with those hazel eyes. The ring will help you find it again. Harry looked at the ring. He'd been feeling it all day, not obtrusively, not distractingly, but present. A warmth in the back of his awareness the way you're aware of sunlight through a window even when you're not looking at it directly. It wasn't doing anything, specifically. It was just, there. Like a frequency he'd been tuned to his whole life without having the right receiver before. What does that mean practically? He asked. It means your magic will change, Godric said, in the tone of someone delivering straightforward practical information. Has it already? Harry thought about the apparition that morning, which had been, different. Cleaner. Like shifting from walking on ice to walking on solid ground. He'd attributed it to practice, but... Maybe, he said. It'll keep happening, Godric said. Don't fight it. Don't try to go back to doing things the way you were trained. The old way is underneath all the procedural learning, it just needs to be let out. He set the wardstone on the windowsill and wiped his hands on his trousers with cheerful informality. Now. What are we eating tonight? I have waited 6 centuries to eat bread and I would very much like to eat bread. You can eat? Ron asked, delighted. While manifested, yes. Godric looked at Ron with the evaluating warmth of someone who is deciding whether to adopt a person. You're a Weasley. Yeah, Ron said. Molly and Arthur's boy. Ron straightened slightly. You know them. I know every family that has given the wizarding world genuine service without adequate recognition, Godric said, and his voice had shifted briefly, the warmth still there but deeper underneath. Your parents have given considerably more than their due and asked for considerably less than they were owed. I want you to know that I know that. Ron's ears went red, but differently than they usually went red. He looked at the floor for a moment and then back at Godric and nodded once. Helga made dinner. Or rather, Helga directed the cooking of dinner with such natural authority that everyone found themselves participating without being explicitly assigned anything, which Harry suspected was a Hufflepuff founding principle in miniature. She gave Ron the bread project because Godric's request had been genuine and she took it seriously. She gave Hermione the herb quantities for the soup because Hermione was precise and precision mattered in proportions. She gave Harry the task of keeping the fire regulated, which was not a demanding task but meant he was in the room and present and part of the thing, which he understood after a few minutes was the actual point. Neville sat at the table and peeled vegetables with practiced ease and talked, hesitantly at first and then more fluidly, about his parents, not the tragedy of them but the actual people, the things his grandmother had told him about who they'd been before, the horror files he'd once found in a box in the attic that his grandmother had thought he didn't know about, his father's case notes and his mother's training records and the particular quality of the work they'd done, the brave specific shape of two ordinary people doing extraordinary things in difficult times. Helga listened to him the way she listened to everything, completely, with her whole attention, and at one point she reached over and covered his hand briefly with hers without saying anything, and Neville let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time. After dinner, with the table cleared and the kitchen quiet, they worked. Rowena spread the Great Hall diagram on the table and walked them through the court configuration. She was a natural teacher, exacting but not cold, demanding not because she enjoyed authority but because she believed in precision and had the rare quality of making other people believe in it too when she explained why it mattered. The Covenant Court required specific spatial arrangements, the 4 founders at the head, as the presiding authority. Harry at a central position, not as defendant but as the bearer of the covenant and therefore the formal initiator of proceedings. Witnesses to one side, on an elevated platform, testimony needed to be visible to the room. The defendants on the other side, likewise elevated. The defendant platform, Hermione said carefully. Dumbledore specifically. Is it designed to be punitive? Is there any element of physical or magical constraint? No, Rowena said. But he'll be compelled to stay. He'll be compelled to attend. What he does once he arrives is his own choice. Rowena met Hermione's eyes. He cannot be forced to testify. He cannot be forced to say anything. If he chooses silence, silence becomes his testimony. A pause. He will not choose silence. He's never chosen silence in his life. What about the public attendance? Harry asked. How does that work? The Covenant summons included a secondary pulse, a notification to every magical person in Britain of sufficient magical maturity. Rowena chose her next words precisely. They will know there is a Covenant court convening at Hogwarts on the specified date. They will know they may attend. The school's capacity will expand to accommodate them. The Great Hall can hold considerably more than its apparent size suggests, under full founder activation. So anyone can come, Ron said. Anyone who chooses to. There'll be thousands, Hermione said. Yes, Rowena said. That is the intention. The fire crackled. Harry looked around the table, Ron, Hermione, Neville, and then at the 4 founders, and the assembly of it struck him with a sudden clarity. This was the team. Not the Order, not Dumbledore's carefully managed chess pieces, not a secret kept dark for strategic advantage. This. People who knew the truth, in a lit room, planning openly. It felt better than anything he'd been part of in a very long time. There's something else, Harry said. He'd been thinking about it all day, working around the edges of it. The Horcruxes. Rowena and Salazar exchanged a look so brief it might have been missed but Harry caught it because he was watching. Yes, Salazar said. The trial exposes Dumbledore's failures. But Voldemort doesn't disappear because Dumbledore is held accountable. The Horcruxes are still out there. We still need to deal with them. Simultaneously, Salazar said. He's been making you the instrument, Rowena said, picking the thread up immediately. His plan, such as it is, requires you to destroy them and ultimately to face Voldemort directly, without full information, in conditions that suit the prophecy but not necessarily you. She paused. He is right that the Horcruxes must be destroyed. He is right that you are connected to this in ways that go deeper than the prophecy. He is wrong that you must be kept ignorant of the full scope of the problem to manage you effectively. She looked at Harry. So. Tell me everything you currently know about the Horcruxes. Harry told her. The diary, destroyed. The ring, he paused on the ring, because of Dumbledore's blackened hand, because of the story of the Deathly Hallows that Dumbledore had been cagey about. The locket, which they hadn't retrieved. The cup, which they suspected. The snake. And then the thing that Dumbledore had been circling around without ever quite landing on, the thing Harry suspected but hadn't been told directly. He thinks there might be one more, Harry said. He hasn't said what. Or he doesn't know. Salazar was very still. He knows, he said. Rowena said nothing, which was a form of confirmation. The ring, Harry said carefully, that Dumbledore destroyed. Not this ring. The gaunt ring. Yes, Salazar said. It was mine. He turned it into a Horcrux. Something moved in his face, a complexity that Harry recognized as the particular pain of seeing something you made used for something you never intended. The Peveril stone set into it was a separate matter, Dumbledore found that out, to his cost. But the ring itself. Yes. That was mine. He looked at Harry's ring, the Covenant ring, with a distinction being drawn that didn't need to be spoken. Different rings. Different purposes. Different legacies. There's one in the school, Harry said. It wasn't a question. It had been building in his mind all day, a shape he'd been tracing without knowing it. Yes, Rowena said, and her voice was entirely level. Something of yours, Harry said. The chamber was quiet. My diadem, she said. Stolen by my daughter. Hidden in the school. Turned into something she never intended and I never imagined. A breath, almost imperceptible. It is in the room of requirement. And yes, it needs to be destroyed. Before the trial if possible, we want no Voldemort contingencies disrupting the proceedings. I can get it, Harry said immediately. We'll come with you, Hermione said, with the flat certainty of someone who was not offering this as a negotiation. Obviously, Ron said, as if any other arrangement was too absurd to waste words on. Neville said nothing but his expression communicated clearly that he was also coming and that pointing this out would be an unnecessary use of everyone's time. Rowena looked at the four of them. The room of requirement responds to need, she said. Your need will be specific, to find what was lost and what must be unmade. Think those words. Nothing more. She paused. The diadem will resist. Voldemort's Horcruxes want to survive. This one will not come quietly. She looked at Harry. The ring will help you with that as well. How? You'll know when you need to. I love when people say that, Harry said. Godric laughed from his chair. You'll leave for Hogwarts tomorrow, Rowena said. The school is accessible, we are not under term time restrictions for this purpose, and the wards recognize the covenant. You'll go directly to the room of requirement, retrieve and destroy the diadem, and return here. 2 days before the court convenes. She looked around the table. Questions? Hermione had 14. Neville had 3. Ron had 1, which was whether they'd have time to eat first, and Godric said yes with absolute conviction before Rowena could answer, and the meeting broke along a natural seam into something that was less strategy and more company, people who were about to do something difficult, choosing to be ordinary for the remaining hours before they had to be extraordinary. Salazar drifted to the window while the others talked. Harry drifted with him, not entirely sure why, just following some instinct. Outside the summer dark was soft and the garden's overgrown shapes were strange and gentle in the dim light. You're quiet tonight, Harry said. I'm frequently quiet, Salazar said. Quieter than usual. A pause. Salazar turned the cup in his hands, one of the mismatched cups Helga had located in the ruins of the kitchen, which were better than they had any right to be. "The diadem," he said. Rowena, knowing that her daughter's theft became this. He looked at the window rather than at Harry. "When you build something, you believe in it. The school. The houses. The principles. You believe they will outlast the small failures and the personal betrayals and the politics. You believe the structure is strong enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Then 1,000 years pass, and you see what was done with the things you most loved and most believed in, and you are confronted with the question of whether you were a fool for believing." Harry thought about this carefully. "Were you?" "No," Salazar said, without hesitation. "Belief in a thing's potential is not foolish just because the thing was later misused. A poorly made bridge is the engineer's failure. What men do on a well-made bridge is their own responsibility." He looked at Harry. "I include myself in that. What I did to the school, the chamber, that was my failure. My fear. Not the school's failure." A pause. "I spent 1,000 years understanding that." "That's a long time to sit with something," Harry said. "It is," Salazar agreed. "I recommend arriving at the conclusion faster if possible." He looked at the ring on Harry's hand. "You don't have 1,000 years. You have what, however long this war lasts. Make the understanding smaller and faster. When you're wrong, say so, and move." Harry looked at him for a moment. "You're giving me life advice." "You're wearing my ring," Salazar said, and something that was finally, unambiguously a smile crossed his face. "I am allowed." Harry laughed, which surprised him, and the sound of it went out into the room and Godric looked over and grinned and Ron looked up from his conversation with Neville and smiled without knowing why, and Hermione and Rowena barely looked up from whatever they were discussing, but Hermione's shoulders relaxed visibly and Helga, from her chair, met Harry's eyes and nodded once in the way she had, the nod that meant something specific, though Harry was still learning to read exactly what. Tonight it meant, good. You're still in there. He went to bed at midnight, up the repaired stairs in the room that Godric had sorted out without fanfare, the floorboard steady and the window intact, a narrow bed that was too short for his current height but functionally adequate. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around him and the night sounds outside and felt, for the second consecutive night, genuinely tired rather than anxiously insomniac. Tomorrow was Hogwarts. The room of requirement. A Horcrux that would not come quietly. He turned the ring on his finger in the dark, feeling the 4 stones warm in their sequence, and let the warmth run up his arm and into his chest like something returning to where it had always belonged. He closed his eyes and was asleep in minutes. Chapter 5, The Weight of Testimony. They reached Hogwarts at dawn. The castle emerged from morning mist the way it always did, not gradually, not politely, but all at once, like a held breath released, every tower and battlement snapping into sharp relief as they crested the hill above Hogsmeade. Harry had seen it dozens of times and it still did something to his chest. Behind him he heard Neville exhale. The grounds were empty at this hour. No students, no staff visible on the lawns, the lake flat and silver in the early light. Harry had expected to feel like an intruder, had half expected wards to register them as hostile, some alarm to sound, McGonagall or someone worse to come striding out across the grass. None of that happened. The moment they crossed the boundary wards, the ring flared warm on his hand, not warning but welcome, the school's ancient magic recognizing the Covenant's authority the way Rowena had said it would. "It knows us," Hermione said softly, her breath visible in the cool morning air. "It knows them," Harry said, because the warmth in the ring wasn't his. It was the Founders responding to the building, the specific recognition of coming home after an extraordinary absence. They went in through the main doors. The entrance hall was dim and cool and enormous in the silence, their footsteps echoing up into the vaulted ceiling. The suits of armor stood at attention. The hourglasses that tracked house points showed empty chambers, their jewels piled at the bottom, and Harry had the sudden memory of Umbridge's hand on the lever, draining Gryffindor's rubies one accusation at a time, and filed it away in the section of his mind currently labeled trial evidence. "Seventh floor," Harry said. They took the stairs at a pace that was purposeful but not panicked, and the castle seemed to respond to that, doors opening ahead of them, corridors choosing the shorter route, the building facilitating their movement in the subtle way it always had for Harry, which he'd always attributed to luck and now suspected was something considerably more intentional. The stretch of blank wall on the 7th floor across from Barnabas the Barmy's tapestry was exactly as he remembered it. Harry stood in front of it and felt the ring pulse twice, quick and specific, and understood Rowena's instruction differently than he had the night before. Not words. Not an incantation. An actual need, stated honestly in the privacy of his own mind. "I need to find what was lost and must be unmade." The door appeared. It opened onto the room of requirement in its hidden things configuration, the vast, cathedral version, enormous beyond any rational architectural possibility, stuffed to the vaulted ceiling with the accumulated secret debris of 1,000 years of students' discarded problems. Towers of furniture. Broken broomsticks. Stacked cages. Decades of hidden contraband rising in columns and mountains and precarious cliffs of forgotten things. The smell of dust and old wood and something underneath, faint but present, that Harry's nose registered before his mind categorized it, sharp and wrong, the specific olfactory signature of corrupted magic. "It's here somewhere," Hermione said, her wand out, her face set. "There," Neville said. He was looking up and to the right. Harry followed his gaze and saw it, not the diadem itself, not yet, but the wrong quality of light in that direction, a shadow that absorbed rather than cast, a place where the room's general amber dusty light seemed to go a degree darker and more deliberate. It was 30 feet up at least, resting on the top of a teetering stack of desks and trunks and things Harry couldn't identify from here. "Of course it's 30 feet up," Ron said. "Room of requirement," Harry said, and kicked off the floor. He was flying without a broomstick. He knew it the moment he left the ground, not a levitation charm, not any technique Flitwick had taught him, but something older that came from the ring and from the place where his magic connected to the school's magic and simply decided that gravity was optional for the next few minutes. He rose clean and fast, leaving the others below, and registered their upturned faces with the detached clarity of the moment before something difficult. The diadem was a thin silver circlet set with a sapphire, and at 30 feet it looked like a beautiful piece of old jewelry resting on a mahogany desk, and Harry reached for it with his right hand, the ring hand, and the room changed. The wrong darkness he'd seen from below snapped into focus as a presence. Not a ghost. Not a founder. Something that lived in the diadem the way the worst parts of Tom Riddle had lived in the diary, a fragment of soul pressed into silver and stone and furious at being found. The temperature plummeted. The stacked towers around him began to shudder. Harry didn't stop or flinch. He reached forward and closed his hand around the diadem. The Horcrux fought back the way they apparently fought back, which was to go immediately for the softest target available. The diadem's intelligence, such as it was, went straight for the grief. He felt Sirius fall through the curtain. He felt it with the full physical force of a fresh wound, the arch of black space, the curtain, the absence. Then it tried his parents. Then it tried the prophecy, the weight of neither can live while the other survives, trying to use his own knowledge against him, trying to make him feel the cage of it. The ring blazed. Not warm this time, hot, genuinely hot, bright through his closed fingers, and what the ring sent back against the Horcrux's attack was not a shield or a ward but something more specific. It was the memory of the chamber at Godric's Hollow, Godric's hand on his shoulder solid and real, Helga saying that can be true and still be monstrous, Salazar saying when you're wrong, say so, and move. The ring gave him the founders, and the founders were not grief and they were not prophecy and they were not the isolation the Horcrux was trying to weaponize. They were presence. They were purpose. They were 1,000 years of people who had built something real and were here to build it again. The Horcrux shattered. It made a sound like ice breaking and a feeling like pressure released, and then Harry was holding a thin circlet of bent silver with a crack running through the sapphire, and the wrong darkness was gone, and the towers around him had stopped shaking. He floated back down to the floor with the same casual ease he'd floated up, landed lightly, and opened his hand to show the others. Hermione had both hands over her mouth. Ron's knuckles were white around his wand. Neville looked at the broken diadem with an expression of quiet, fierce satisfaction. "Did you just fly?" Ron said. "Apparently," Harry said. "Without a broom." "Without a broom." Ron looked at the broken Horcrux, then at Harry, then at the ring, then back at Harry. "Right," he said. Yeah. That's fine. Is it destroyed?" Neville asked, looking at the cracked sapphire. "Yes," Harry said. He could feel the difference. The ring confirmed it the way it confirmed things, not with words but with a clear, clean silence where there had been noise before. One Horcrux gone. However many remaining. "We need to go. The trial is in 2 days and Rowena will have things that need doing before then." He pocketed the destroyed diadem. Evidence. They were almost to the 7th floor corridor when the voice came. "Harry." He stopped. Dumbledore was standing at the far end of the corridor. Not imposing, not theatrically positioned, just standing, the way a very old man stands when he's genuinely tired, with the slight forward incline that Harry had always read as thoughtfulness and now read as something more complicated. He was wearing robes that were slightly less magnificent than usual, deep blue rather than the astronomical purples and magentas he favored for effect, and his half-moon spectacles caught the corridor light and made his eyes hard to read. Harry turned to face him fully and waited. "I received the summons," Dumbledore said. "I know. I have also received 17 separate communiques from the Ministry, 10 from board members, and 2 from Minerva." A pause. "I am aware that you retrieved something from the Room of Requirement this morning." "I destroyed it," Harry said. "One of Voldemort's Horcruxes." He held Dumbledore's gaze steadily. "Which I could have done sooner if I'd had the full information." Something moved across Dumbledore's face. Not defensiveness, something more honest than that, which Harry found both harder and more important. "Yes," Dumbledore said quietly. "You could have." "You know about the Covenant Court," Harry said. "I do." He looked at the ring. His eyes rested on it with an expression Harry had never seen Dumbledore wear before, not coveting, not the acquisitive shimmer Harry always associated with men who wanted powerful objects, but something almost like grief. Recognition, maybe. The expression of a man who has been found out and is deciding what to do with the experience of being found out. "You understand what you've activated." "Better every day," Harry said. "The Founders," Dumbledore said. "Not a question." "All 4 of them." A long pause. The corridor breathed. "I imagine Salazar has particular things to say," Dumbledore said, and there was something in it, not dismissiveness, not the comfortable contempt of a man writing off a source as biased. Genuine inquiry. "He's the most specific about the gap between intent and outcome," Harry said. "He says he'd know." Dumbledore absorbed this. Then he did something Harry hadn't expected, he looked away. Not evasively, not from shame exactly, but from the honest need of a moment to manage something felt. When he looked back his expression was different. Stripped of the considered serenity that was his default presentation. Just the man. "I am going to attend the trial," Dumbledore said. "Not because I was summoned, though I was. Because I believe I should." A breath. "I won't pretend I'm not afraid of what it will look like. I won't pretend I have not slept particularly well since the summons arrived." "No," Harry said, and there was nothing cruel in his voice but there was nothing soft either. "I imagine you haven't." Harry. The name, from Dumbledore, was always complicated, weighted with affection and strategy simultaneously, and Harry had always felt both those things and not known how to handle the combination. Now he felt them and handled it. Let them both be true, let them both matter, let neither of them change what needed to happen. "I did love you. I want you to know that clearly," whatever else the trial says. I know, Harry said. And I failed you. Repeatedly and in ways that I justified to myself with sufficient sophistication to avoid examining them properly until, he stopped himself. Until now. You'll say all of that at the trial, Harry said. And Rowena will cross-examine you, and Salazar will probably be uncomfortably precise about the parts where you knew better, and Hermione has a list of specific documented failures that she's organized chronologically, and all of that will happen publicly in front of everyone who needs to hear it. Yes, Dumbledore said simply. And then we'll deal with Voldemort, Harry said. Together, like it should have been from the start. With full information. With all the help that should have been available all along. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, and in that look Harry saw a great many things, the headmaster and the manipulator and the genuinely brilliant man and the grieving human being and the weight of 80 years of choosing the greater good over the immediate specific cost, and beneath all of it, most foundational, a man who had been right about enough important things to make being wrong about the others feel justified and who was now, perhaps for the first time, sitting with the arithmetic of that without immediately resolving it in his own favor. I'll see you in the Great Hall, Harry said. He turned and walked away. His friends fell into step around him. Nobody looked back. The 2 days before the trial moved with the quality of time before a storm, fast in activity, strange in atmosphere, the world seeming to hold itself slightly differently, as though aware something irrevocable was approaching. They returned to Godric's Hollow, reported to the Founders, and the final preparations happened in a state of concentrated calm that Harry had learned to associate with Rowena specifically. She ran a tight operation without ever being authoritarian about it, which was its own kind of impressive. Ginny came the afternoon before the trial, brought by Hermione's Patronus message, arriving at the house with her hair down and her chin up and the particular expression Harry associated with her since second year, the one that said she had decided something and the decision was irreversible. She walked through the parlor, assessed the Founders with a single sweeping look that lingered longest on Salazar not from fear but curiosity, turned to Harry and said, I'm testifying about the diary. You don't have to, I know I don't have to. She sat down at the kitchen table with the ease of someone claiming space she was entitled to. I want to. I've wanted to say it out loud in a room full of people for 4 years. She looked at the table. The diary knew things about me. It got into my head. It told me the school was safe, that the adults around me were capable and present and aware, her jaw tightened. And none of it was true. A student was carrying a piece of Voldemort's soul in her first year and nobody caught it. Nobody found it. She looked up at Harry. I need to say that where people can hear it. Okay, Harry said. She nodded. Then she looked at the ring on his hand and something changed in her expression, something warmer and more complicated. That suits you, she said. Does it? Yeah. She stood up and went to introduce herself to the Founders with the brisk social confidence of a girl who had grown up in a house full of brothers and developed considerable immunity to intimidation as a survival mechanism. Godric took to her immediately and completely. This surprised no one. The morning of the trial arrived clear and cold for July, the sky a clean unambiguous blue that Harry took as neither omen nor reassurance, just weather. They left Godric's Hollow at 8 in the morning, all of them together, and arrived at Hogwarts to find that the wizarding world had been arriving since before dawn. The grounds were full. Not disorderly, there was something about the Covenant's authority that seemed to communicate itself even to crowd behavior, people moving with a subdued purposefulness that felt different from the usual wizarding public gathering. Families with children. Old witches in archaic robes. Young ministry workers in their neat gray uniforms. People Harry didn't recognize from every corner of the country, and a few he recognized all too well. He saw Seamus and Dean standing with the Patil twins near the edge of the lake, all 4 of them looking at the castle with expressions that said they'd received the notification and come immediately. He saw Neville's grandmother standing near the doors with the posture of a woman who had decided to stop being managed by events and had arrived on her own terms. He saw the Weasleys together near the beech tree, Arthur and Molly and all available Weasley children, which was most of them, gathered in the way the Weasley family always gathered under pressure, by instinct, like an organism that contracts toward its center when threatened. Molly saw Harry across the grounds and her face did something extraordinary, a rapid sequence of emotions that resolved into the kind of determined love that doesn't waver even when it's frightened. She crossed the distance and hugged him before he could say anything, fiercely, the way she always did, and didn't say a word. He hugged her back. "Right then," she said, pulling back, straightening his collar with the reflexive habit of a woman who expressed love through small physical adjustments. "Go do what you need to do." They entered the castle and the Founders manifested fully as they crossed the threshold. Not the subdued, slightly tentative presence of the Hollow, this was the school, and in the school they were whole. Harry felt the shift in them immediately, the specific quality of authority that comes from being exactly where you were made to be. Godric's presence in the entrance hall was like a fire in the room, everyone who saw him knowing instinctively that he had belonged here before any of them and would belong here after. Helga moved through the space with the warmth of someone returning to something loved. Rowena's eyes moved over the building with the particular gaze of a person cataloging the changes to their own work. And Salazar walked through Hogwarts with his chin level and his eyes clear and the specific quality of a man who had been ashamed of something for a very long time and had decided to be present anyway, which was its own form of courage. Students who hadn't yet entered the hall stopped and stared. A small group of third years flattened themselves against the wall as the Founders passed, and one of them, a tiny Gryffindor girl with enormous eyes, said "Oh" in a voice barely above a whisper, not from fear but from the particular recognition of something being more real than you'd prepared for it to be. The great hall had transformed. Rowena had done her work, the room's Founder magic fully activated, the ceiling blazing with its true function for the first time in the living memory of everyone present. The long house tables were gone, replaced by banked seating along both sides, rising from the floor in curved ranks that allowed every person in the enormous space a clear view of the center. The floor itself was clear stone, polished to a mirror quality that reflected the ceiling's extraordinary light. At the far end, where the staff table normally stood, there was now a raised platform with 4 seats, not thrones, nothing so theatrical, but chairs of obvious age and authority, each in a different stone, each catching the ceiling light differently. Beside the platform, to the left, the witness stand, elevated slightly, open, a chair and a lectern. To the right, the defendant's area, also elevated, also open, with chairs for Dumbledore, Fudge, and Umbridge and adequate space for whoever the board sent as representative. In the center of the floor, equidistant from all sides, a single standing position marked by a circle of light. Harry's place. The room was already filling. People poured through the doors behind them and found seats with a quiet efficiency that felt compelled not by any authority but by the room itself. Rowena had done something to the space that made it communicate clearly how it was meant to be used. Harry watched it happen with the feeling of watching something designed to be exactly what it was finally being, that thing. He walked to the center. Took his place in the circle of light. The ring was burning steadily on his hand, all 4 stones blazing in sequence, a slow heartbeat of ruby gold sapphire green that threw his shadow 4 ways at once against the polished floor. The room went quiet when he stopped moving. Not the quiet of people obeying an instruction but the deeper quiet of people registering that something was beginning. Harry looked at the doors. Dumbledore came in first. He came alone, without fanfare or delegation, in those same blue robes he'd worn in the corridor, and he walked through the packed hall to the defendant's platform with his head up and his hands behind his back and an expression of someone who has made a considered decision about how to carry themselves through an experience that is going to be difficult and has chosen dignity. He sat. He did not look at Harry immediately. When he did, when their eyes met across the floor of the hall where Harry had spent 5 years of his education, the look held for a moment and then Dumbledore inclined his head, the smallest possible acknowledgement. Harry held his gaze and didn't return the gesture. Fudge came in behind a contingent of ministry officials, walking fast and pink-cheeked with a version of authority that was very loud because it was nervous, taking his seat with the look of a man sitting on something sharp and resolving not to show it. 3 board members filed in, the full 12, Harry knew, were somewhere in the hall, but only 3 had been designated to sit in the formal defendant area. Umbridge came last. She wore pink. Of course she wore pink. She walked in with a smile that was entirely disconnected from her eyes, and the sound in the room changed when she entered, not one unified response but several overlapping ones, a current of recognition that was not warm, moving through the assembled crowd. Harry felt it from the center of the floor like weather. She sat. She folded her hands. She continued to smile. Harry made a particular note to feel nothing about her presence for now and filed the note. The Founders took their seats at the head of the room. The ceiling blazed. Rowena rose. She didn't need to call the room to order, the room was already ordered. She stood at the front of the platform and looked out at the assembled wizarding world and said, in a carrying voice that somehow reached every person in the hall without effort or magic that anyone could identify, "This is a Covenant Court, convened under the original founding authority of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. We are the four who built this school and bound ourselves to its principles and made a promise 1,000 years ago that the principles would not be abandoned without answer." She paused. "We are here to answer." The ceiling recorded it. The court will hear testimony beginning with the account of the petitioner, and proceeding through witness testimonies, and ending with the defense. She looked at Harry. "Harry James Potter. You hold the Covenant ring. Please state your purpose." Harry looked at the ring on his hand, and then at the assembled crowd, and then at Dumbledore, and finally back at Rowena. His voice came out steady and clear and completely unhurried. "I'm here because I grew up in a cupboard," he said, "while the man who put me there knew exactly what I was and what was coming and chose not to tell me." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "And because that was the least of it." The ceiling caught his words and held them, and the silence after them was so complete that Harry could hear his own heartbeat. He told his story. Not the same way he told it in the chamber, not privately and unspooling over hours, but publicly and with precision, shaped by 2 weeks of Rowena's preparation into a testimony that had the specific architecture of legal argument without losing any of its human weight. He moved through it with the ring warm on his hand and the Founders behind him and his friends visible in the front row of the seating, Hermione's quill moving, Ron's jaw tight, Neville's hands still on his knees, Ginny watching him with the clear-eyed attention she brought to everything. He talked for 40 minutes. Nobody interrupted. Then Rowena called the witnesses. Neville went first, because Rowena had a precise sense of dramatic and evidential sequencing and she knew what Neville's testimony would do to the room. He walked to the witness stand and sat in the chair with his hands flat on the armrests and his voice level and clear, and he talked about his parents. Not their heroism, though it was there, implicit in every word. Their ordinary particularity. The things they had been before. The specific night, which he'd reconstructed from his grandmother's reluctant fragments and his father's archived case notes. What had been known? What had not been prevented? The great hall was absolutely silent. There were people crying quietly in the seating. Harry could see it from the center, the particular stillness of people trying to manage an emotional response in public. He saw Arthur Weasley, 3 rows back, with his hand over his mouth. He saw McGonagall, near the front of the standing space reserved for staff, with her hands clasped in front of her and an expression of controlled devastation. Rowena asked 3 questions of Neville when he finished. The questions were precise and gentle and extracted from his testimony 3 specific points that she then displayed for the room in written form, summoned into the air above the witness stand in clear clean text, the Founders' magic serving as projection. 3 documented failures of protective intelligence. 3 times that adequate warning might have saved something. Ginny went second. She sat in the witness stand with her back straight and told the room about the diary in the flat, unaffected voice of someone who has processed a thing through and arrived on the far side of it. She described the possession, the loss of herself, the gradual disappearance of her own thoughts and the substitution of another's, and she described it not as a horror story but as an account, specific and detailed, and the account was more terrible than any horror story would have been. She was in her first year, she told the room. She was 11 years old. She was carrying a piece of the most dangerous dark wizard alive in her school bag, and the people responsible for her safety did not catch it. Then she said something that Harry had not heard her say before, had not known she was going to say, and which landed in the room like a stone in deep water. "I was 11 years old," she said, "and I blamed myself for 4 years. Because nobody told me it wasn't my fault. Nobody sat me down and said, 'You were a child, and you were failed, and that failure was not yours to carry.'" She looked at the room steadily. "I'm saying it now. It was not my fault. And the question this court should ask is whose fault it was, and why nobody said so sooner. The ceiling recorded it all." Luna testified third. Luna's testimony was, characteristically, unlike anyone else's. She spoke about Umbridge's inquisitorial squad with a quality of calm detachment that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been, describing specific incidents with specific dates and the names of specific students, in a voice that had the dreamlike quality of someone narrating something that was happening to another person, which was, Harry realized, exactly how Luna had survived it. She then made 3 observations about the structural conditions that had allowed Umbridge to operate that were so analytically precise that Harry saw Rowena's expression shift with something unmistakably like professional appreciation. When the last witness of the morning session sat down, the room needed a moment. Rowena gave it one. She let the silence run for 30 full seconds, not uncomfortable silence, not the silence of nothing to say, but the silence of too much to say and the need to hold it for a moment before the next thing. Harry stood in his circle of light and looked at Dumbledore across the floor, and Dumbledore was very still and very pale, and he was not looking at Harry but at the ceiling, where every word of every testimony was still present, imprinted into the enchantment Rowena had built 1,000 years ago for exactly this purpose, the school keeping its own record, incorruptible and complete. He looked like a man reckoning with something. Good, Harry thought, without cruelty. That was the point. "The defense will speak after midday," Rowena said to the room. "The morning session is complete." The murmur that rose from the assembled crowd was not chaos. It was the sound of 1,000 people turning to each other and trying to find language for what they just witnessed, which was the truth, plain and complete, and which had the specific effect that Salazar had predicted. It had gravity, and people felt it whether they wanted to or not. Harry stepped out of the circle of light and walked to his friends. Ron handed him a sandwich from somewhere and didn't say anything, which was perfect. Hermione put her hand on his arm briefly and also said nothing. Neville sat beside him in the corridor outside the hall where they ate, and after a while said, "That's the first time I've said it out loud. All of it. To people. How does it feel?" Harry asked. Neville thought about it honestly. "Like putting something down that I'd been carrying so long I forgot it was heavy," he said. Harry looked at the ring on his hand. Yeah, he thought. That was exactly it. Chapter 6, Dumbledore Speaks. The afternoon session began at 2. The crowd that filed back into the Great Hall was different from the morning crowd in a way Harry couldn't entirely quantify but felt clearly. The morning had been anticipatory, people arriving with theories and loyalties, and the specific energized tension of those who expected to have their existing views confirmed one way or another. The afternoon crowd was quieter. More deliberate. People who had spent the midday break not eating and talking but sitting with something uncomfortable and deciding what to do about it. Harry watched them come in from his position in the entrance hall and thought about what Salazar had said about uncertain minds being the real audience. The uncertain ones were visibly processing. He could see it in the particular quality of stillness in faces that had been animated this morning, the stillness of internal revision happening in real time. Fudge's contingent had grown. 3 more ministry officials had arrived during the break, clustering around him in the defendant's area with the tight, conspiratorial energy of people attempting a tactical response to a situation that had already moved past the point where tactics were useful. Fudge himself looked like a man trying to decide whether to look confident or grave and managing to achieve neither. One of his officials was writing rapidly on a scroll, the frantic pace of someone drafting an official objection who knows the objection will accomplish nothing but needs to be seen drafting it. Umbridge had not moved during the break. She was still in her chair, still smiling, still folded. Harry had looked at her twice during the morning session and both times felt the cold specific discomfort of seeing someone genuinely unmoved by testimony about their own conduct. Not performing ease. Actually, constitutionally unbothered. He filed that observation next to the one about feeling nothing about her and left both to Rowena. Dumbledore had spent the midday break in the corridor outside the hall, alone. Harry had seen him through the open door, standing by the window that looked out over the grounds, quite still, his hands behind his back, the specific stillness of someone doing important internal work. He hadn't tried to approach Harry. He hadn't spoken to the ministry officials or the board members. He'd stood at the window and looked out and let the morning's testimony settle into him, and when the afternoon session was called he walked back in and took his seat with the same quality of deliberate dignity as before, but something different in the set of his shoulders. Something that had been braced was no longer braced. Harry took his position in the center circle. The ring pulsed in sequence. The founders settled in their seats. Rowena rose. The court will now hear from the defendants. She paused. Minister Fudge. The court has heard testimony regarding the ministry's conduct during the period of your-know-who's return and denial thereof, including the sustained campaign to discredit a student witness and suppress accurate information about a genuine and active threat. She looked at him without inflection. Do you wish to speak in your own defense? Fudge stood. He had clearly prepared something. There was a square of parchment in his hand that he unfolded with the deliberate ceremony of a man who believes formal documents confer authority. He cleared his throat. He said the words he had prepared, which were arranged in the specific structure of political apology that acknowledges errors in principle without ever quite admitting to a specific one. He said mistakes were made, and with the benefit of hindsight and acting in what we believe to be and the ministry remains committed to, and Harry watched the room receive his words with the collective expression of people being offered something they have already decided is insufficient. Salazar, from his seat, did not move or speak. He simply watched Fudge with gray-green eyes that had the quality of cataloging something, and his stillness was considerably louder than Fudge's carefully prepared statement. When Fudge finished, Rowena asked him one question. 1. In October of 1995, when Harry Potter presented testimony before a formal ministry disciplinary hearing regarding the return of Voldemort, testimony that you subsequently had published in a student newspaper after official channels were closed to him, testimony that proved entirely accurate, what did you know, at that time, about Albus Dumbledore's assessment of the threat? The question was very specific. Fudge's expression changed in a way that had nothing to do with considered response and everything to do with being caught. The minister receives considerable intelligence from many. What did you know, Rowena said again, with the identical inflection, about Albus Dumbledore's assessment of the threat? A long pause. The ceiling waited. Dumbledore had informed the ministry that he believed the Dark Lord had returned, Fudge said. His voice was smaller. Fully. He had informed the ministry fully. Another pause. Smaller still. Yes. And your response to this accurate information from Britain's most senior magical authority was to launch a campaign to discredit both the witness and the informant. It wasn't a question. Fudge sat down. The board's representative, a tall witch named Griselda Marchbanks, whose longevity and stubbornness had apparently survived even the accountability charm's impact with her dignity mostly intact, gave testimony about the board's conduct regarding Dumbledore's repeated removal and reinstatement and the specific board votes that had allowed Umbridge's appointment as High Inquisitor. She spoke with the careful precision of a woman who had decided the most dignified available option was complete honesty and was pursuing it rigorously. Then Rowena said, Dolores Umbridge. The room went extremely still. Umbridge rose. She was smiling. Harry genuinely could not decide whether the smile was a choice or a reflex or something that had simply replaced all other facial expressions through years of continuous use. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at Rowena and said, pleasantly, I acted entirely within the authority granted to me by the Ministry of Magic. Yes, Rowena said. You did. The Ministry's authority to deploy you in the manner it did is a separate matter addressed through Minister Fudge's testimony. What this court is concerned with specifically is the conduct you chose within that authority. She paused. You administered a blood quill to students as punishment. Multiple students. Over an extended period. Disciplinary measures were necessary, a blood quill, Rowena said, and her voice had changed character slightly, still controlled, but with an edge underneath that the room felt, is a dark object. Its use constitutes the intentional, sustained infliction of bodily harm through magical means on persons in your legal care. It is prohibited under 14 separate wizarding protection statutes, the earliest of which predates the ministry by 200 years. She let that sit. You used it on children. Umbridge's smile was still present. Students required, you used it on a 15-year-old boy to force him to carve the words "I must not tell lies" into the back of his own hand. Rowena's voice was completely level. The levelness was the frightening part. Repeatedly. Until he bled. Until it scarred. The room made a sound. Not a word, a collective intake of breath and the particular quality of silence that follows it, the silence of mass recognition. I'll ask you one question, Rowena said. The same question I will ask in different forms throughout this afternoon until the court has heard sufficient answer. Did you know the blood quill caused permanent scarring? A beat. Disciplinary, yes or no? Umbridge's smile thinned. Students, yes, Rowena said, turning away from her, or no? Yes, Umbridge said. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Rowena sat down. Godric looked at Umbridge from his seat with an expression of such flat, quiet disgust that two people in the front row shifted visibly away from Umbridge's side of the room, as though the disgust had physical mass and they wanted to be clear of its trajectory. Albus Dumbledore, Rowena said. The room shifted its attention. Dumbledore rose. He was tall, and old, and in that moment Harry thought he looked both, taller than usual and older than usual, as though the afternoon had added something to the visible weight of him. He turned to face the room rather than the Founders' platform, which Harry noticed and understood. He was speaking to the people, not to the court. A choice. An intentional one. Rowena noticed it too, and let it stand, because it was honest. I will not give a prepared statement, Dumbledore said. I had one. I discarded it this morning. He paused. I discarded it because this morning I heard 5 people describe their experiences in and around this school, and it would be disrespectful to respond to that level of honesty with something I drafted and polished and designed to land well. The room was very quiet. I will tell you what I believe to be true, he said, and I will tell you where I believe I was wrong, and I will tell you why I made the choices I made, and I will not ask for your understanding or your forgiveness, because asking for those things is a manipulation of the emotional register of this conversation, and I believe I owe this room something better than that. Harry watched Hermione in the front row. She had stopped writing. Her quill was still. She was watching Dumbledore with an expression that was not warm but was paying the closest kind of attention. I have known about the prophecy since before Harry Potter was born, Dumbledore said. I knew what it likely meant. I made a decision, the first in a long series of decisions, that Harry Potter's safety depended on his isolation, his ignorance, and his proximity to his mother's blood. These things were true, in a strictly practical sense. He paused. They were also convenient. They were convenient because a child raised in knowledge of his own history, his own lineage, his own considerable power, would have been considerably harder to manage. The word manage fell into the room with a specific weight. I used the word intentionally, Dumbledore said. Because that is what I was doing. From the moment Harry arrived at this school, I managed him. I gave him information at the pace and in the quantities I judged he could process. I protected him from truths I believed would overwhelm him, which was in part genuine concern and in part the concerned party's desire to remain the one doing the protecting. He looked at Harry directly for the first time since rising, and his eyes were old and honest and carrying something complicated. There is a specific pleasure in being trusted. In being the person to whom someone turns when they are frightened and lost. I allowed that pleasure to inform decisions I told myself were purely strategic. Nobody moved. The Horcruxes, he said. I have known about them for several years. I have been conducting my own investigation with the aim of understanding the full picture before presenting it to Harry. He paused. I told myself this was prudence. That presenting incomplete information would confuse rather than illuminate. What I did not examine honestly enough is that incomplete information presented at intervals, by a single trusted source, creates dependence. It creates a student who needs his teacher rather than a partner who can operate independently. He looked at his hands briefly, at the blackened right hand, partially concealed by his robes but not entirely. Harry is not a student. He has never been only a student. Rowena said, from her seat, the ring. The gaunt ring. You knew it contained a deathly hallow. Dumbledore turned to her. Yes. You destroyed it without telling Harry what it was. Yes. You pursued the Hallows personally, and privately, while ostensibly managing his education about Voldemort's vulnerabilities. Yes. A breath. My interest in the Deathly Hallows it is the most personal failure I will discuss today, and I will discuss it because this room deserves it, but it is not a simple story and I ask the court's patience with it. Rowena inclined her head. He told the story of Ariana. Of Gellert Grindelwald. Of a golden summer in his youth when he had been 17 and brilliant and so in love with power and its possibilities that he had constructed an entire philosophical architecture to justify the pursuit of both. The words "the greater good" in his voice carried the particular weight of a phrase that has been lived with for 70 years, held up and examined and found wanting and put back down and picked up again in different lights. He talked about his sister's death and what it had done to him. About the specific wound of not knowing whose spell had killed her, his, Aberforth's, Grindelwald's, and how that wound had calcified over decades into a particular kind of grief that expressed itself as control. As the compulsive need to know outcomes before they happened. As a terror of losing people that had manifested, perversely, in decisions that isolated the people closest to him. I saw in Harry, he said, the children I had failed. Ariana, whom I was too brilliant and too ambitious to protect properly. The students I lost in the wars. The people I moved like pieces on a board, telling myself the board was what mattered. He paused. And I saw the prophecy's subject. A boy who would either defeat Voldemort or die trying. I could not look at those two things simultaneously. So I looked at the strategy and told myself I was protecting the person. Salazar spoke. He had not spoken yet in the formal proceedings, had sat in his chair with the stillness of someone with enormous patience and a very specific moment in mind. When he spoke now, the room turned to him with the quality of attention it gave to things that had been earned. You are an intelligent man, Salazar said. One of the most genuinely intelligent people to have moved through this school in the centuries since we built it. A pause. Tell the court this. You understood the Horcrux magic. You understood what Voldemort had done. At what point did you become aware of the possibility that Harry himself might be a Horcrux? The room went so quiet Harry could hear the candles. Dumbledore was very still. Several years ago, he said. Be specific. Shortly after Harry's second year, Dumbledore said quietly. The diary. The way Voldemort had transferred his memory and partial essence into it. The way Harry destroyed it and survived the encounter. The specific way he survived, he stopped. I began to suspect then that the night Voldemort's curse rebounded and destroyed his body, something of Voldemort may have anchored to the only living magical vessel present. The ceiling recorded every word. And you continued to manage his education, Salazar said. You continued to meter out information. You continued to construct the path toward the confrontation you believed was inevitable, knowing, suspecting, strongly, that the boy you were guiding might himself need to die at the end of it. Yes, Dumbledore said. Harry heard the word and felt it in his chest and was surprised by what he felt, which was not rage, not the volcanic white anger he would have expected from himself even 6 weeks ago. What he felt was something colder and more specific. Not rage. Confirmation. He had known, in the way you know things you haven't been told, the deep instinctive knowing that lives in the body before the mind catches up. He had known this was coming. He stood in the circle of light and breathed. "Did you intend," Salazar said, and his voice was even and precise, "for Harry to survive the final confrontation?" Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly. Opened them. "I believed there was a possibility of survival," he said. The Elder Wand. The Deathly Hallows. The specific nature of the Horcrux within him. I theorized, that the Horcrux might be destroyed without destroying Harry, if the approach was right. He paused. But I did not know. I had a theory and a hope, and I could not test either without the event itself. He looked at Harry. I planned for the possibility of your death. I called it sacrifice and told myself it was beautiful because calling it sacrifice made it easier to live with than calling it what it was. Which was? Salazar said. Gambling with someone else's life, Dumbledore said, because I lacked the courage to find another way. The room was completely silent for a long moment. Then Helga spoke. She had not spoken during the formal proceedings either, and the quality of her silence had been different from Salazar's, not strategic, not held for a specific moment, but processing. The expression of a woman who had been feeling everything in the room all afternoon and now had something to say about it. You love him, she said to Dumbledore. It wasn't a question and it wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact presented without comfort or absolution. Very much, Dumbledore said. And you were willing to sacrifice him. I was willing to accept his death as a possible cost. Yes. These two things, Helga said, are the heart of what you did wrong. Not the secrecy, not the manipulation, not the Horcrux theory, though all of these are serious. The heart of it is this: you decided that your love and your strategy could occupy the same space without corrupting each other. That you could love a child and simultaneously plan for his death and somehow keep those two decisions clean and separate. She paused. They could not be kept separate. The love made the planning harder. The planning poisoned the love. And in between those two things, Harry Potter grew up in a cupboard and came to school not knowing what he was, and was managed rather than known, and was not told things that were his right to know, and went through 5 years of this school carrying burdens that should have been distributed and supported and were instead concentrated on a single boy because concentrating them was more strategically convenient. She was not raising her voice. The lack of raised voice was the most powerful thing about it. You are not a wicked man, she said. You are a wise man who convinced himself that wisdom was sufficient protection against the specific damage that wisdom cannot prevent. A pause. This is the most dangerous kind of failure, because it is the hardest to see. Dumbledore said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough in a way Harry had never heard from him. Yes, he said. Rowena rose. The court has one final question for the defense, she said. It is addressed to Albus Dumbledore specifically. She looked at him. If you were to begin again, not with different information, not with the benefit of hindsight, but with the same knowledge and the same circumstances and simply different choices, what would you do differently? Dumbledore looked at Harry. I would tell him, he said. Everything. From the beginning. I would sit with a boy in a cupboard under some stairs and I would tell him who he was and what he came from and what was likely coming, and I would say, you are not alone in this. You will not be managed or sacrificed or strategically deployed. You will be helped. He paused. I would ask for his help. Rather than commanding it through ignorance. He sat down. The room breathed. Harry stood in a circle of light and looked at Dumbledore, who was looking at the floor, and felt the complicated weight of a man who had just been completely honest in public for perhaps the first time in his life, which was its own terrible courage and did not cancel anything but was not nothing either. Godric rose from his chair and looked at the assembled room. He had a quality when standing that was entirely natural and somehow impossible to look away from, not performed authority but the real thing, the settled certainty of a man who built something from nothing and watched it survive 1,000 years and was not done with it yet. "This court will recess until tomorrow morning," he said. "At which point the founders will deliver their judgment." He looked out at the packed hall, at the thousands of faces from across the wizarding world. "Go home tonight. Speak to each other. Think about what you heard today. Not what you were told to think before you arrived, what you actually heard." His eyes swept the room. "That is what this school was built for. Not compliance. Not management. Not the production of people who know the right answers without having done the work of thinking." A pause. "Come back tomorrow ready to hear something true. We've had enough of the other thing." The hall began to clear, and the noise of it was different from a normal crowd dispersal, quieter, slower, the movement of people unwilling to rush away from something significant, needing to stay in the proximity of it for a little longer. Harry stepped out of the circle. Hermione was beside him in seconds, and she did something she almost never did, which was hug him without saying anything first. Her arms around him were tight and her face was against his shoulder and he felt the tension in her, not distress but the specific physical relief of someone who has been holding something large and careful for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Ron put his arm around both of them from the side. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," Harry agreed. Neville was standing nearby, talking quietly with his grandmother. Harry could see the old woman's face. Augusta Longbottom, who he had always found slightly terrifying, was not terrifying in this moment. She was holding her grandson's hand and her expression was the particular expression of a woman who has been angry for a very long time and has today found an appropriate place to put it. She said something to Neville that Harry couldn't hear and Neville nodded and something passed between them, the private renegotiation of a long relationship in a single exchange. Ginny was sitting on the hall floor near the wall, which was exactly the kind of thing Ginny would do after a significant emotional event, sitting on floors and processing alone before rejoining the world. Harry walked to her and sat beside her, back against the stone wall, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while. "How are you?" he asked eventually. "Better than I expected," she said. It was, saying it out loud to people. She thought about it. Rowena was right. He said it, actually, in the chamber before we started. Salazar said truth has gravity and people feel it whether they want to or not. She looked at Harry. "Did you know Dumbledore was going to say all of that?" "No," Harry said honestly. "But you're not surprised?" He thought about it. "No. I think I knew he was capable of it, if the situation was, if there was no escape route. He's not a coward, whatever else he is. He just needed a room he couldn't talk his way out of." "Rowena built a good room," Ginny said. "Yeah," Harry said. "She did." They sat there until the hall was almost empty, and the extraordinary ceiling went to its normal evening gold and candlelight above them, and the ring on Harry's hand pulsed quietly in its four-part rhythm, and somewhere above them in the castle his parents' school, their school, was quiet in the way old buildings are quiet, not empty but resting, holding its memories, waiting for the morning. Chapter 7, Judgment. Harry didn't sleep. Not from anxiety, or not only from that. It was more that the night felt too significant to spend unconscious. He lay in his dormitory bed in Gryffindor Tower, which McGonagall had opened without being asked, and stared at the hangings and listened to Ron's breathing slow and even out beside him and thought about tomorrow with the particular focused clarity that the ring seemed to bring to everything. The ring was warm all night. Not blazing, not signaling, just present, the steady four-part pulse of it like a second heartbeat, and Harry lay with his right hand on his chest and felt all four of them in it, the founders keeping their own kind of vigil somewhere in the castle's ancient bones. At some point past 2 he got up and went to the window. The grounds below were lit by a clear half-moon, the lake silver and perfectly still, the forbidden forest a dark mass at the edge of the world. There were lights in some of the other tower windows, people who couldn't sleep either, witnesses and attendees and curious witches and wizards who'd found beds in Hogsmeade and couldn't settle. The wizarding world, turning something over in the dark. He thought about Dumbledore's voice saying I would tell him everything. From the beginning. He thought about what that version of his life might have looked like. A boy who arrived at Hogwarts knowing his own history, his own heritage, his own power. A boy who wasn't a blank slate onto which someone else could write a story. A boy who might have made different friends, different choices, might have walked through 5 years of this school with a different quality of, not ease, not safety, the world wasn't that for anyone, but agency. The knowledge of what he was and the freedom to be it. He couldn't quite imagine it. The life he'd had was the only one he had, and grief for the unlived one felt both valid and unproductive, and he was aware of the tension between those two things without needing to resolve it tonight. What he could imagine, what felt very close and very real, was the world after tomorrow. Footsteps in the corridor. He turned from the window. Hermione was in the doorway, her hair wild and her dressing gown wrapped tight, holding a mug of something steaming. She looked at him, looked at the window, came in and sat on the end of Ron's bed without waking him, which was impossible under normal circumstances and which Harry attributed to either Hermione's considerable stealth or Ron's considerable exhaustion. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "I got about 2 hours." She handed him the mug. "Tea, very strong. The kitchens are accessible at night. The house elves are, they were glad to see someone. I think the trial has been strange for them too." "Strange for everyone," Harry said. She tucked her knees up and looked at him with the direct, undiluted attention she gave to things that mattered. "How are you actually? Not how are you for consumption. How are you?" Harry looked into the tea. I don't know how to explain it." He tried anyway. 2 months ago I was in Dumbledore's office and he was telling me about the prophecy and I was breaking his things and I felt like the walls were closing in from every direction. Like the world had been designed specifically to make everything impossible. He paused. "Now I feel like, the walls are still there. The prophecy is still true. Voldemort is still out there. None of the actual problems have been solved. But I don't feel trapped by them anymore. I feel like they're problems that can be worked on." "Because you have more information," Hermione said. "Because I have more information, and better help, and because someone finally," he thought about how to say it. "Because someone finally looked at my situation and said this is wrong without immediately following it up with but here's why it's necessary. Just, this is wrong. Full stop." Hermione was quiet for a moment. "Rowena said something to me today. Before the afternoon session started. She looked at the window. She said the most insidious thing about Dumbledore's approach wasn't the specific failures but the epistemological one. The way he made sure you didn't know enough to evaluate your own situation. Because a person who doesn't have sufficient information can't identify their own constraints." "Sounds like Rowena." She also said, Hermione smiled, the particular smile she only produced when a quote was too good to paraphrase, that the most important thing Hogwarts ever failed to teach was how to think about what you don't know. Harry thought about that. "She's going to change the curriculum." "Oh," dramatically, Hermione said, with a kind of reverent certainty. "I've already discussed it with her. She has plans." "Harry, she has plans." The reverence deepened. "She wants to rebuild the theoretical magical education framework from the ground up. Actual magical theory, not just application. The history of magical traditions, plural, not just British wizarding history. She wants to teach epistemology." A pause. "I may have cried slightly." Hermione. "I was tired and it was emotional," she said, without apology. Harry laughed quietly, not wanting to wake Ron, and Hermione laughed too, and for a few minutes they were just two friends in a dormitory in the middle of the night and it was completely ordinary and completely good. Then Hermione said, more carefully, "What happens after the judgment?" To Dumbledore specifically. "Do you know what they're going to, what form it takes?" "Rowena hasn't been specific," Harry said. "But she said it wasn't execution." Obviously it isn't execution. And it isn't imprisonment. Or, not ordinary imprisonment. He turned the ring on his finger. She said judgment means what it means in the old sense. Not punishment. Consequence. The difference being that punishment is about pain and consequence is about truth. Hermione considered this. That's a meaningful distinction. It's a Rowena distinction. She finished her tea and unfolded herself from the bed. At the door she paused. For what it's worth, whatever happens tomorrow, you were right to do this. Not just strategically. Actually right. She met his eyes. I wasn't sure, when you first told us. I had concerns about process and precedent and whether covenant law could hold up to ministry challenge. She paused. I still have some of those concerns. But I've watched 5 people stand in that hall today and say true things out loud for the first time, and I've watched the room receive them, and I think this was the only way those things would ever have been said. She left before he could respond, which was typical Hermione, deliver the important thing and give it space to breathe. He went back to bed and was asleep before he'd consciously decided to sleep, and when he dreamed of the chamber at Godric's Hollow, all 4 stones blazing in the dark, and woke in the morning feeling like himself in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Specifically, entirely himself. The great hall at 9 in the morning was even fuller than the previous day. Word had spread overnight, not just through the wizarding community but in the particular way that significant things spread, ahead of any official channel, carried by the specific gravity of events that people understand instinctively to be historical. Harry saw faces he hadn't seen yesterday. He saw what appeared to be an international contingent in one corner, robes from France, from Eastern Europe, one group who he thought might be from West Africa based on the style of their dress. The Covenant, apparently, had a longer reach than Britain. He saw Aberforth Dumbledore standing at the back of the hall near the doors, arms crossed, face unreadable. He had the look of a man who had not wanted to come and had come anyway, which was a form of honesty that Harry recognized and respected. He saw the Hogwarts ghosts clustered near the east wall, nearly headless Nick, the fat friar, the Grey Lady, the Bloody Baron, and the Grey Lady's expression when Harry passed her was remarkable, a layering of emotions that he now understood differently. Rowena's daughter. Watching a trial that had her mother's name on it. Helena Ravenclaw, who had stolen the diadem and caused a chain of consequences that had traveled through centuries and ended in a Horcrux now broken in Harry's pocket. He crossed the hall to her before taking his position. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at him with the same evaluating clarity she'd always had, that quality of the Ravenclaw ghost that he'd always found slightly unnerving and now found simply honest. "I should testify," she said. "You don't have to, I know what I did," she said. "The diadem. What it became because of what I did with it. I should say so." She paused, and her translucent form was very still. "My mother doesn't blame me. She told me that last night. I'm not sure I believe her entirely, but the telling of it was something I needed." "I can ask Rowena if she wants to add you," Harry said. "She already knows," the Grey Lady said. "I spoke with her this morning. She said the court would hear me." A pause. "She said, and I am still deciding what to do with this, she said she was proud of me. Not in spite of what I did but because of what I'm choosing to do with having done it." Harry thought of Salazar, saying I was on the wrong side of it, once and placing it on the table without theater. "That sounds right to me," he said. He took his position in the circle at 9 precisely. The Founders came in through the door at the back of the hall, behind the platform, and walked in single file, Godric first, Helga, Salazar, Rowena last, and the room stood. All of it. Without anyone asking or suggesting, without a call to order, people simply rose as the Founders walked through the hall, the instinctive response to presence that cannot be faked or manufactured, the specific recognition of something real. The only person who didn't stand was Umbridge, and the contrast was so stark it required no commentary. The Founders took their seats. The room sat. The court will complete its proceedings this morning, Rowena said. The court first wishes to hear from one additional witness. Helena Ravenclaw drifted to the witness stand. She testified in 10 minutes, clear and complete, the theft of the diadem, the lie she told to conceal it, the centuries of guilt, and the Horcrux. She named Tom Riddle specifically, described the interaction in the Albanian forest with the cold precision of someone who has relived a moment many thousands of times and has learned that only accuracy prevents it from becoming distorted by grief. She finished by saying, "The diadem is destroyed. The wrong I caused in my vanity and my anger at my mother has been unmade. I cannot undo the centuries between the theft and the unmaking. But I can say what I did, here, where it can be recorded." She drifted from the witness stand and returned to the east wall, and Rowena watched her go with an expression that was private and complete and not for the room. Then Rowena stood. "The court has heard sufficient testimony to proceed to judgment," she said. Before doing so, the court acknowledges that Albus Dumbledore provided testimony yesterday that the court considers genuine, and in doing so demonstrated a quality of honesty that the court records formally. She paused. This acknowledgement does not mitigate the findings. It contextualizes them. She looked at Fudge. "Cornelius Fudge. This court finds that you deliberately and systematically suppressed accurate information about an active threat to the wizarding world for the purposes of political self-preservation. You used the apparatus of the ministry, its publication relationships, its legal structures, its aura force, to discredit witnesses and silence accurate testimony. You are not a stupid man, and you understood the consequences of this suppression." She paused. "The Covenant Court cannot remove you from office. That is a matter for the wizarding electorate and the ministry's own oversight structures. However, the Covenant can do this." She pressed 2 fingers to her temple and drew out a thin thread of silver blue light, and the room watched as she carried it to the ceiling and pressed it gently into the enchantment, where it spread like ink in water. "This court's finding is now imprinted in the permanent record of this hall. Every statement you made under testimony. Every document placed in evidence. Permanent and unalterable and accessible to every person who asks this building to show them the truth." She looked at him. "You may keep your office or you may resign. But every decision you make from this day forward will be made in the knowledge that this record exists. That is consequence." Fudge was very red and very still. His officials had stopped writing. Dolores Jane Umbridge. The room was absolutely quiet. Rowena looked at Umbridge with the expression of someone who has done very precise work and is satisfied with its precision. "This court finds that you engaged in the sustained, deliberate, and conscious infliction of harm on students in your care. You used institutional authority as a mechanism for cruelty. You derived satisfaction from the exercise of power over those who could not resist it, and you operated with sufficient self-awareness to ensure that your methods, while technically within the letter of ministry authorization, fell outside the spirit of every protective principle that authorization was built on." A pause. "You are not a person confused about the nature of your actions. You knew what you were doing and you chose it consistently." Umbridge opened her mouth. "I have not asked you a question," Rowena said, without looking at her. Umbridge closed her mouth. "The Covenant Court recommends to the ministry, in terms that constitute the strongest possible covenant directive short of binding magical compulsion, which we have chosen not to employ because we are better than that, immediate removal from any position involving authority over minors or students. Furthermore, the court hereby invokes a standing accountability charm on your person." Umbridge's smile disappeared. "Not a punishment charm," Rowena said. "You will feel no pain. You will simply find it very difficult to be unaware of the effects of your choices on others. The precise quality of awareness you lacked in this school will now be available to you in full." She paused. "I expect you will find it uncomfortable." "Good." Something happened in Umbridge's face that was perhaps the most honest expression Harry had ever seen on it. The smile was entirely gone, and what replaced it was smaller and more human and not pleasant for anyone, including Umbridge. "The Hogwarts Board of Governors." The board's representative straightened. This court finds that the board's conduct over the past decade represents a systematic failure of governance. The school operates under your oversight and you have exercised that oversight primarily in service of political convenience and social conservatism rather than the welfare of students. Rowena's voice was precise and even and completely merciless. The accountability charms you received with your summons are permanent. They are not shackles, they are mirrors. Every decision you make about this school will be accompanied by a clear and visceral awareness of its actual effect on the children in it. She paused. The court further recommends that the board's composition and its terms of appointment be subject to mandatory review by an independent body within the year, with specific provisions for student and staff representation in governance. She looked at them levelly. You built an oversight body that oversaw primarily your own interests. That ends. She turned to Dumbledore. The room held its breath. Dumbledore was looking at her with the composed attention of a man who has prepared himself for something he doesn't want to receive. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The full name. Harry noticed it. So did everyone else. This court's findings in your regard are the most complex we have addressed today, because you are the most complex figure before us, and the court will not simplify you for the sake of easy judgment. She stood very still. You are one of the greatest magical minds of the past several centuries. You have done genuine, profound, lasting good in this world. You defeated Gellert Grindelwald at personal cost that the world did not fully appreciate. You rebuilt the Order of the Phoenix. You identified the Horcrux problem when no one else had the magical architecture to understand it. You have spent the last 20 years in genuine opposition to the most dangerous dark wizard since the founder of the school in this room whose name I carried. She paused. And you have, across a career spanning decades, consistently prioritized your own strategic judgment over the autonomy and full personhood of the people you were supposedly protecting. You have withheld information from people who had the right to it and the capacity to use it. You have managed rather than partnered. You have loved people and simultaneously prepared to spend them. She looked at him without flinching. You are aware of all of this. You said so yesterday, here, in this room, in front of the wizarding world. The court records your acknowledgement as genuine and significant. Dumbledore said nothing, and waited. Godric rose. He stood beside Rowena and when he spoke his voice had a quality it hadn't quite had before, not louder, but deeper, the voice of the man who built the school rather than the man who'd been sitting companionably in a parlor eating bread and talking Quidditch. This was the Godric who had laid ward stones in the Scottish Highlands and looked at a piece of land and decided to build something that would outlast him by 1,000 years. Albus, he said, and the informal address was deliberate and felt, you are the headmaster of a school you did not build. You have held that position longer than any person before you. In that time you have added to this school and damaged it in roughly equal measure. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. The court's judgment is not removal from office. The room shifted. It is this, Godric said. You will remain headmaster. Because removing you now, in the middle of an active war against the most dangerous dark wizard in 5 centuries, would be strategically ruinous, and we are not interested in burning the building down to prove a point about its structural flaws. He paused. But your authority is no longer sole. Beginning immediately, this school will operate under a Founders' Council, for representatives, one designated by each founder line, whose oversight of the school's operation is binding and non-circumventable. These representatives will have full access to all information relevant to the school, to its students, and to any external situations that affect its people. Rowena said, Harry Potter will serve as Godric's representative. The room reacted. Not explosively, more like a long exhale. He is not your weapon, Rowena said, and the words were addressed to Dumbledore specifically, clearly, unmistakably. He is not your instrument, your chosen one, your sacrificial subject. He is Godric's heir, and the Founder's representative, and a person with rights and full information and the complete support of this court in whatever path he chooses to walk. She paused. You will work with him, Albus. Not above him. With him. Dumbledore looked at Harry. And something happened in his face, not defeat, not the resignation of a man having something taken from him. Something else. Something that looked, under all its complexity, like relief. Like a man who has been carrying the specific weight of total responsibility for too long and has just been told he doesn't have to carry it alone anymore, and who finds, to his own surprise, that this is what he wanted and couldn't ask for. Yes, Dumbledore said quietly. Helga rose last. She stood and looked at the room, the full enormous room, packed with the wizarding world of Britain and beyond, thousands of people who had come to watch something be decided and were now receiving the decision, and she spoke not about the defendants but about the building. This school was built on a promise, she said. The promise was simple. Every magical child in Britain deserves a place that is safe, and worthy of them, and honest with them. She looked at the ceiling, where the day's record was imprinted alongside 1,000 years of history. We find that promise was not kept. Not fully. Not consistently. Not by the people entrusted with it or the systems built around it. She looked at the room. We are not here to end the school. We are here to return it to itself. To what it was supposed to be. She looked at Harry. That work will take longer than a trial. It will take longer than a war. It will take the rest of your lives and probably beyond. She let that sit. We are going to help you do it, she said. Salazar rose last, and he didn't speak immediately. He looked at the room with those gray-green eyes that had been watching human behavior for 1,000 years, and whatever he saw in the assembled faces seemed to satisfy something he'd been uncertain about. Then he looked at the Slytherin section of the seating, students who had come back for the trial, Harry noticed, Slytherins from 5th, 6th, 7th year, sitting together with the particular wariness of people who are used to being used as a symbol and weren't sure what this day would do to that. My house, he said, addressing them directly, and the specificity of it made several of them sit straighter, has been used as a shorthand for dark magic and bad faith for 500 years. Some of that is deserved. Much of it is not. My legacy was stolen by a small, brilliant, damaged boy who found in my name a justification for things I never intended and would not have sanctioned. He paused. I am reclaiming it. Beginning now. He looked at the room. Ambition is not evil. Cunning is not cruelty. Pragmatism is not the same as ruthlessness. My house will teach those distinctions again. My values, as I held them, not as Voldemort perverted them, will be what Slytherin means in this school. He looked back at the students. That is not a small thing. That is the thing I should have protected and didn't, and I am asking your help to do it now. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences of the trial. It was the silence of a room full of people recalibrating. Rowena spoke the final words of the court. The Covenant Court is adjourned. The judgments rendered here are imprinted in the permanent record of this hall and cannot be altered, suppressed, or reinterpreted. The Founders' Council is hereby constituted. The school is returned to its founding purpose. She looked out at the room. You are all witnesses. Act accordingly. She sat. And the room erupted. Not chaos, or not only chaos. The eruption had layers. People on their feet, talking, arguing, crying, the specific noise of a very large number of people having a significant experience simultaneously and trying to share it in real time. Harry stood in a circle and let it wash over him, and the ring was blazing on his hand, all 4 stones at full brightness, throwing red gold blue green light in 4 directions across the polished floor. Ron was through the crowd before the noise had fully peaked, solid and present, clapping him on the shoulder with both hands and saying something that was lost in the noise but communicated clearly through the grip. Hermione arrived half a second later, and this time she was crying openly and not pretending she wasn't, which was its own watershed. Neville crossed the floor and shook Harry's hand, formal and genuine, and then seemed to find formality insufficient and hugged him instead, quick and hard. Ginny came last and said nothing at all, just looked at him with those clear, direct eyes and smiled, and the smile was complicated and knowing and entirely real. Dumbledore crossed the floor toward Harry through the dispersing crowd, and the crowd parted for him with the instinctive deference of long habit, and he stopped in front of Harry and looked at him for a moment. "I would like to begin," Dumbledore said, "if you are willing." "Begin what?" Harry said. "Working with you. Not above you." He paused. "There are things I know about the Horcruxes that I have not told you. There are things about the prophecy's implications that I have interpretations of which you deserve to hear." He paused. "And there is the small matter of bringing down Voldemort, which will be considerably more achievable with full information distributed among people who trust each other." Harry looked at him for a long moment. "You'll answer every question I ask," Harry said. "Directly. No pedagogical management, no rationing." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "And when you think you know better than me about something affecting my own life, you'll say so openly and make the case and then let me decide." "Yes," Dumbledore said again. Something shifted in his face, the ghost of a different kind of smile than his usual one. Less magnificent. More real. "Okay," Harry said. Around them the wizarding world was in motion, dispersing and regrouping and talking in urgent clusters, people calling to each other across the hall, alls beginning to depart from the windows with the first dispatches to newspapers and families and ministries abroad. Aberforth was still at the back of the hall, and Harry caught his eye across the distance, and Aberforth gave him a nod so minimal it barely qualified as communication, and turned and left, which was exactly what Harry expected from him and felt correct. McGonagall appeared at his elbow with the expression of a woman who has processed something enormous and emerged with her characteristic efficiency fully reinstated. "The council," she said briskly. "The Founders' representatives. You'll need to appoint the other 3, one for Hufflepuff, one for Ravenclaw, one for Slytherin. Do you have thoughts?" "Neville for Hufflepuff," Harry said immediately. Neville, who was close enough to hear, said, "What?" And then straightened his spine and said, "Yes. All right." "Hermione for Ravenclaw," Harry said. Hermione made a sound that was not quite a word. "Luna for Slytherin," Harry said. Several people nearby looked at him with the specific expression of "that's unexpected." Harry didn't explain. Luna Lovegood had the most ruthlessly accurate perceptual intelligence of anyone he knew, thought entirely independently of social convention, and had the specific quality of Slytherin pragmatism without an ounce of its historical cruelty. Salazar, when Harry looked at his seat on the platform, was looking at him with an expression of clear satisfaction. "Right," McGonagall said, and produced a quill from somewhere with the practiced ease of a woman who had been keeping quills about her person for 30 years because things always needed writing. "I'll draft the formal council documents." "Professor," Harry said. She paused. "Thank you for testifying." She looked at him, and a great many things moved through her expression in quick succession, and what landed was the thing he'd seen on her face 2 days ago in the fire, the private, precise reckoning of a person who loves and has failed and is choosing what to do next. "Don't thank me for doing what I should have done sooner," she said. "Thank me when the school is what it should be." She clicked her quill. "Which it will be. I'll see to that personally." She walked away, already drafting. Harry stood in the emptying hall with his friends around him and the ring warm on his hand and the Founders ceiling above him recording every moment with the patient completeness of a building that had been waiting a very long time to be fully itself. The covenant was kept. Chapter 8, After the Reckoning. 3 weeks after the trial, Fudge resigned. He didn't announce it publicly as a resignation. The official statement from the ministry used the phrase "stepping down to pursue other opportunities," which was the political equivalent of placing a politely worded sign over a large hole in the floor. Everyone knew what it was. The wizarding world had spent 3 weeks reading the trial transcript, which Rowena had ensured was distributed in full, in print and by magical broadcast, to every wizarding household in Britain, and the specific quality of Fudge's testimony had not survived the reading. His approval figures, according to the Daily Prophet's own poll, had gone from contested to catastrophic in the space of a fortnight. Amelia Bones was appointed interim minister on a Tuesday morning. She was precise, experienced, and had the quality Harry had always associated with people who went into public service because they actually believed in it rather than because they found power comfortable. She sent Harry a single-sentence letter the day of her appointment: "The ministry is listening. Tell me what you need." He wrote back a list. It took 3 pages. She responded to every item. The Death Eater trials that had been quietly tabled during Fudge's tenure were reopened. 7 people who had been walking free under the claim of Imperius were brought before actual trials with actual evidence and actually convicted. Lucius Malfoy, who had spent the 3 weeks since the Covenant Court in the specific white-faced silence of a man watching every wall of his carefully constructed life develop significant structural cracks, was arrested on a Tuesday afternoon and taken to Ministry holding with a directness and lack of ceremony that Harry suspected he found more insulting than the arrest itself. Draco Malfoy passed Harry in the corridor at Hogwarts 2 weeks into term and said nothing and kept walking, which was either the longest pause in their 6-year war or the beginning of something else. Harry let it be whatever it was and kept moving. The Daily Prophet was, predictably, a disaster. Rita Skeeter had covered the trial with the specific breathless sensationalism she brought to everything: Harry Potter and the Ghost Army, Hogwarts Founders return from beyond. And the coverage had been extensive and largely inaccurate in its emphasis, which was perhaps inevitable when Rita was involved. But the transcript was available, unedited, everywhere, and it turned out that the raw truth distributed at sufficient scale was harder to manage than any individual piece of journalism. People had read it and formed opinions that owed nothing to Rita's framing, and the opinions were various and contested and loud and fundamentally democratic in a way the wizarding world hadn't quite managed before. Several independent publications had emerged in the weeks following the trial. New Wizarding Voice. The Covenant Review, which Hermione was already writing for under a pseudonym she had abandoned within the first week because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving good work uncredited. A small student newspaper at Hogwarts called The Record, which Luna was editing with the specific editorial vision of someone who found the interesting question in every story that everyone else had overlooked. The first issue of The Record had a front-page article about house elf rights that made Hermione cry for the second time in a month and immediately send a very long owl to Amelia Bones. Harry came back to Hogwarts for 6th year and it was different. Not dramatically different, not transfigured overnight into the school the Founders had described in the parlor at Godric's Hollow, not perfect or fully healed. But different in a specific, significant way that things are different when their foundation has shifted. He noticed it first in small things. The house points being given and taken more consistently, without the favoritism that had been so calcified it had stopped being visible. The Slytherin table at meals, less hunched and watchful than it usually was, some of the students eating with the particular ease of people who have stopped bracing for something. The DA, which had quietly reconstituted itself in the first week of term, meeting now openly in a classroom that McGonagall had allocated without being asked, the members coming and going in full view with none of the clandestine anxiety of the previous year. He noticed it in McGonagall, who moved through the school with the particular energy of a woman who has decided exactly how she is spending the rest of her professional life and has found the decision clarifying. She had been at 4 of the Founders' Council meetings already, attending as an observer by invitation, and she asked questions that made even Rowena pause occasionally, which Harry found privately delightful. He noticed it in himself. He still had homework. He still had potions with Slughorn, who had replaced Snape with a genial competence that was neither better nor worse, just different, and who looked at Harry with the specific expression of a man calculating social proximity to a famous person and finding the math pleasing. He still had Quidditch practice and transfiguration essays and the ongoing challenge of teaching himself occlumency properly, this time with Rowena's notes on the subject, which were to Snape's methodology what a full surgical theater is to being hit over the head with a rock. But he also had the ring, and the ring meant the Founders were accessible in the specific way Rowena had described, warm when they were available, cool when they weren't, and a pulse when something needed attention. He'd had a total of 14 conversations with one or more of them since the trial, pulled from ordinary moments, walking to class, sitting by the lake, once in the middle of quidditching practice when Godric had apparently decided that the formation Harry was using for the Wronski feint was technically inferior and needed immediate commentary. He'd nearly fallen off his broom laughing, which had confused everyone. He was in his 6th-year charms lesson on a Wednesday in October when Hermione passed him a folded note under the desk. "Rowena wants to see us tonight. 3rd floor corridor, the new council room. Bring Ron." He passed it to Ron, who read it and wrote "Can I eat first" underneath it and passed it back. Harry showed it to Hermione, who wrote obviously and folded it away. The council room was new, or rather, it was older than anything else in the castle, a room that had been sealed since the founders' time and which the school had opened when the council was constituted, the way a house opens a room that has been locked for good reasons and is now needed. It was a circular room on the 3rd floor with a round table in the center and 4 chairs marked with the 4 house emblems and 4 others unmarked, one for each council member, and a 5th beside Harry's that had appeared unbidden on the 2nd meeting and which everyone had silently agreed was for whoever else happened to need to be there, which had included McGonagall, Neville's grandmother, Amelia Bones, and once, memorably, Dobby, who had arrived of his own initiative and provided a quality of perspective on the school's elf population that had materially changed 3 council decisions. The founders were already there when Harry arrived with Ron and Hermione. Rowena was at the table with parchment in front of her, Salazar beside her, both of them in the attitude of people who have been discussing something complex for some time. Godric was standing near the window with his arms crossed, and Helga was in her chair with the stillness that meant she was thinking carefully about something and wasn't ready to say it yet. Neville and Luna arrived together from the corridor. They'd been spending more time together lately, a development that made a certain natural sense, 2 people who had been systematically underestimated by everyone around them finding each other's company comfortable and honest. They sat. "The remaining Horcruxes," Rowena said, without preamble. Harry straightened. "Dumbledore and I have been working through the list," he said. "We've confirmed 5 destroyed, the diary, the ring, the diadem. He destroyed Slytherin's locket 2 weeks ago, I was there." He paused. "That leaves Hufflepuff's cup, Nagini, and the last one. Himself." The word sat at the end of the sentence unspoken and everyone at the table knew what it was. "We need to address that," Helga said quietly, and her voice was the particular careful warmth of a person who is about to say something that needs saying and has thought very carefully about how. "The Horcrux within you is not like the others," Rowena said. She'd been working on this, Harry could tell, the way you tell when Rowena had been working on something, from the quality of her certainty. The others were deliberately placed in objects chosen for their significance and durability. Yours was an accident. A fragment of a soul at the moment of its greatest violence, seeking anchorage in the only available living vessel. She paused. The theories about destroying it relied on you dying and being resurrected through the Elder Wand's connection. My theory is different. Tell me, Harry said. The Horcrux is a fragment of Voldemort's soul. It was placed accidentally into a living magical being, something Voldemort did not intend and would not have chosen. The distinction matters because an accidental Horcrux is differently attached than a deliberate one. She spread her hands on the table. A deliberate Horcrux is pressed into its container through an act of will and dark magic. It fuses. It becomes part of the object's magical structure. An accidental Horcrux is lodged. Like a splinter. The surrounding tissue has grown around it, adapted to it, incorporated it in ways that make it feel native. She met Harry's eyes. But it is not native. And unlike a splinter, it can be drawn out without destroying the host. Harry stared at her. Can you do that? He said. Not alone, she said. But together, all 4 of us, at full manifestation, with you holding the ring in full covenant connection, I believe we can. She paused. It will not be painless. That's fine, Harry said immediately. It may be very painful, Salazar said, with his particular quality of direct honesty. That's also fine, Harry said. Ron made a sound that suggested it was not, in fact, entirely fine with him, but he said nothing because he understood that this was not his body and not his decision. When? Harry asked. When you're ready, Helga said. Harry looked at the ring. Felt the 4 stones warm against his palm. Thought about the fragment of Voldemort's soul that had lived inside him since he was 1 year old, shaping his ability to speak Parseltongue, giving him those dreams, that connection, that terrible intimacy with a man who had killed his parents. He thought about what it would be like to not have that. To be only himself. Now, he said. Godric looked at him with bright eyes. You're sure? Yeah, Harry said. I've been ready for this since I was 1 year old and didn't know I was ready for it. Let's go. They cleared the table. Harry sat in the center of the council room, cross-legged on the stone floor, and the founders arranged around him in a circle, not at the 4 compass points but closer, within arm's reach, a closeness that felt both practical and intentional. Rowena had a specific set of instructions and she walked through them once, precisely, and Harry listened with the full attention the ring seemed to help him maintain. Neville, Hermione, Ron, and Luna stood at the room's edges. Not participants in the working itself but present, which was what the moment required, witnesses, anchors, the specific weight of people you loved being in the same room while you did something difficult. Rowena said, hold the ring steady. Think about yourself. Not the prophecy, not the Horcrux, not Voldemort, you. What you know yourself to be. Harry closed his eyes. He thought about flying. The specific physical joy of it, the way altitude felt like freedom, the wind and the cold and the precise moment of the best catch he'd ever made in the 9 seconds of a match against Hufflepuff in 3rd year, the snitch warm in his palm. He thought about chess with Ron by firelight in the Gryffindor common room. He thought about Hermione's face when she figured something out, the specific blazing precision of it. He thought about the Hollow, the first night, all 4 stones lit in the dark, and the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be by his own choice. He thought about Sirius, and let the grief of it be clean and honest and his, not a wound being used against him but something he carried because he loved someone who was gone. He thought about his parents with the knowledge he had now, his mother's magic, her particular instinctive genius, the specific tradition that Salazar had named for him. His father's family line, the Peverils, the Hollows, the history that had been kept from him and was now his to know. He thought about them not as mythology but as people. People who had been in this fight and paid a cost and who had left him, among other things, a ring in a chamber and a foundation ward key to his blood and a mother's sacrifice that was the single most powerful magical act in a century. He thought, I am Harry Potter. I am Godric Gryffindor's heir. I am my mother's son. I am nobody's weapon. I am here. The ring blazed. It blazed the way it had in the chamber on that first night, all 4 stones at full brightness, the light so vivid it was visible through his closed eyelids, red gold blue-green cycling and then merging, 4 things becoming one thing, and the warmth of it traveled from his hand up his arm and into his chest and filled the space there with a heat so specific and so intentional that he understood it was finding something, isolating it from the surrounding tissue of himself by being so entirely himself that the foreign fragment became impossible to mistake. He felt it. He'd always felt it, on some level, without knowing what it was, a darkness at the back of his mind, not large, not always present, but there, the specific cold shadow of something that had always told him things about Voldemort's moods and movements and which he had never quite been able to separate from himself. Now, with the ring fully active and the Founder's combined presence surrounding him like something structural, he felt where the shadow ended and he began. The 4 Founders said something simultaneously. Not in English. Not in any language Harry could identify. Old enough to be pre-linguistic, the kind of sound that carries meaning in its quality rather than its vocabulary, for voices in perfect harmony that resonated not in his ears but in his bones. The Horcrux came out. That was the only description for it. It came out, drawn from its lodging with a precision that the word extraction barely covered, a cold darkness lifting from his chest the way a long-held breath releases, and the pain of it was real and significant and not as bad as dying, which was the bar he'd been measuring against. He heard himself make a sound. He felt Rowena's hand on his right hand, steady and cool. He felt Godric's hand on his left shoulder with the same solid reality as that first day in the chamber. He felt Helga's presence in front of him, warm and anchoring. He felt Salazar behind him, perfectly still, the cold precision of his particular magic creating a channel that made the extraction clean. And then it was done. The darkness hung for a moment in the air above him, visible, briefly, as a shadow with no source, and then Rowena said one word in that old language and it was gone. Not dispersed. Not relocated. Gone, fully and permanently unmade, and the ring's light faded back to its steady four-part pulse and the room was just a room again. Harry sat very still for a long moment. Then he opened his eyes. The ceiling of the council room had small stars in it, he'd noticed them before but not paid attention, assuming they were decorative. He looked at them now and understood they were something else, the same recording function as the Great Hall's ceiling but smaller, more private, this room's version of the same magic. He looked at them and they looked back with the patient attention of things that have been watching for a very long time. How do you feel? Helga asked. Harry thought about how to answer that accurately. Like a window that's been cleaned, he said. The same size. But more light through it. Godric made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more moved than a laugh. Good lad, he said, which was what he always said and which Harry had decided was the highest compliment in Godric's register and had stopped pretending it didn't matter. Ron was crouched beside him in seconds, both hands on Harry's arms, checking him over with the specific focused attention of someone who has been trying not to panic for the past 20 minutes and is now performing a thorough post-event assessment to confirm that the not panicking was justified. You're all right, Ron said. I'm all right, Harry confirmed. Because if you weren't all right I was going to be extremely upset. I know. Good, Ron said, and sat back on the floor beside him because standing up apparently required more composure than he currently had, and Harry sat beside him on the council room floor and Hermione sat on Harry's other side and Luna and Neville settled nearby and for a while nobody said anything ambitious, just sat in the quiet of something significant having happened and being allowed to be significant without immediately rushing past it. Luna said, eventually, there are 6 Horcruxes destroyed now. 5, Harry said. Nagini's still out there. And Hufflepuff's cup, Neville said. Dumbledore thinks he knows where the cup is, Harry said. We're going after it this weekend. This time we meant what it should always have meant, Harry, and Dumbledore, and the people Harry chose to bring, with full information distributed equally and decisions made together. It had been a strange 3 weeks, working with Dumbledore in the new configuration. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but requiring a continuous recalibration on both sides, Dumbledore adjusting to actually sharing information and Harry adjusting to a Dumbledore who was doing so. There had been a conversation in Dumbledore's office on the first day of term that had lasted 4 hours and covered everything Dumbledore knew about the Horcruxes, the Hallows, the prophecy's implications, and 6 specific incidents from Harry's time at Hogwarts that Dumbledore had managed and why. Harry had asked questions throughout and Dumbledore had answered them without deflection and at the end of it Harry had felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for years. Not forgiveness, precisely. Not yet, and maybe not ever in the clean simple version of the word. But something more useful than either forgiveness or its absence, a clear-eyed understanding of who Dumbledore was, in full, and a decision about how to work with that specific complicated brilliant flawed person in service of something they both actually wanted. The cup was retrieved on Saturday. Dumbledore identified the location, a vault in Gringotts under the Lestrange name, which required a level of institutional negotiation that Dumbledore was considerably better equipped for than any alternative. Harry went with him, and Neville went because Neville had asked to be included in any active operation and had framed the request with the precise mild certainty of a person who knows what they're capable of and is done waiting to be asked. Hermione went because she had done the analytical work on the vault's defenses and it seemed pointless to send her research without her. They came back with the cup destroyed and without casualties and with a story involving a Gemino curse and a Flagranti curse and a dragon that Neville mentioned in passing as a footnote and which Harry suspected would become significantly more expanded in the retelling over time. Nagini was the last Horcrux. She was also Voldemort's familiar and constant companion, which meant her destruction was not a separate operation but part of the final confrontation, which was coming and which everyone in the castle felt the approach of the way you feel a storm before any clouds appear. In the meantime, the school was changing. Rowena's curriculum revision was underway, piloted in the 5th and 7th years first and working outward. Harry sat in on the first new session of magical theory, a class that hadn't existed before and now met twice weekly in a room that Rowena had personally configured, and watched 15 fifth years encounter magic as a subject of genuine inquiry for the first time. The teacher was a young witch named Professor Alexopoulos, recruited from Athens by Rowena's specific recommendation, and she taught with the quality that Rowena seemed to identify above all others, the ability to ask good questions and leave them open long enough for students to actually think. Hermione sat in the back of that class and didn't say a word for the first 40 minutes, which was unprecedented, and then asked a question about the epistemological basis of one theory that Professor Alexopoulos met with such evident delight that the entire class leaned forward. The house system was under review. Not abolished, the founders were explicit about this, had made the case for the houses remaining as communities of affinity rather than silos of tribalism. But the sorting process was changing, and the way houses interacted in shared common spaces and classes was changing, and the specific culture of each house was being examined by its students and staff in ways it hadn't been examined before. The Slytherin common room had invited Neville to come and speak about his parents. He'd gone, and come back quiet and thoughtful, and told Harry that the quality of listening in the room had been better than he expected. Harry was in the Great Hall on a Thursday evening in November, doing Transfiguration homework at the Gryffindor table, when the ring went cold. Not its neutral temperature. Cold. The specific cold that meant Voldemort was in motion. He stood up before he'd consciously decided to stand. Ron, across the table, looked at his face and stood too without asking. Hermione, at the end of the table, closed her book. The ring pulsed twice, Salazar's pulse, the deep water green of it. Harry walked to the door of the Great Hall and straight to the Founders' Council room, because the pulse was a summons and he understood Salazar's communication by now. He was there in 4 minutes. The Founders were already present, fully manifested, and they were arranged not around the table but near the window that looked north, all 4 of them, with the alert collective stillness of people who have been expecting something. "He's moving," Salazar said, as Harry came in. "He's been massing forces in the north of Scotland for 3 weeks. He was waiting for something." "The cup," Harry said. He felt it. "Yes." Salazar turned from the window. "He knows most of his Horcruxes are gone. He is no longer waiting for the right moment. He is moving now, before the last ones fall, because the longer he waits the more advantage he concedes." "When?" Harry asked. "Days," Rowena said. "Not weeks." "Right," Harry said. He turned around, because Ron and Hermione and Neville and Luna were all in the doorway, having followed without being summoned, because that was who they were, and he looked at them and felt the ring warm on his hand, all 4 stones cycling steady and clear. He thought about all the things that had led to this moment, the chamber at Godric's Hollow and the letter on cream parchment and the ring and the trial and the testimony and the judgment, and Fudge stepping down and Bones stepping up and Malfoy in Ministry holding and the new magical theory class and Neville in the Slytherin common room and the Hogwarts ceiling recording everything that was said in honesty. He thought about Sirius, which he let himself do briefly and cleanly and then moved past. He thought about his parents in the way he could think about them now, as people who had fought and built and chosen and paid the highest cost, whose legacy was not martyrdom but magic, not sacrifice but love of the specific, serious, Salazar acknowledged kind that was the oldest and most powerful in the world. He thought, "I am ready." Not in the sense of having no fear, he was afraid, specifically and honestly, the clear-eyed fear of someone who knows what they're walking toward and has assessed it accurately. But afraid and ready were not mutually exclusive, and he'd known that for a while now, and the knowing of it had stopped being a comfort and started being a simple fact. "We're going to need to move fast," he said. "I need to talk to Dumbledore tonight." "Already happening," McGonagall said, appearing at his shoulder with the uncanny timing she'd had for 6 years and which Harry had never been able to explain. "He's waiting for you upstairs." She looked at the Founders. All of you, I assume. All of us, Godric confirmed, with the expression he wore when something large and necessary was about to happen, bright and focused, the face of a man who had been born for exactly this kind of moment and had been patiently waiting for it to arrive. They went upstairs. The meeting in Dumbledore's office lasted until 2 in the morning and covered everything: the intelligence about Voldemort's position, the logistics of Nagini, the specific mechanics of what Harry now knew about the prophecy and how the Horcrux removal had changed the mathematical shape of it, the question of who needed to be where and when. Dumbledore contributed information with the fullness and immediacy of a man who had spent 3 weeks practicing being a genuine partner and was getting better at it. The Founders contributed 1,000 years of strategic and magical knowledge without condescension or qualification. Harry contributed himself, his understanding of Voldemort, his instincts, his read on which information mattered most, his knowledge of the people who would be fighting alongside him, and nobody managed him or redirected him or decided his contribution needed to be rationed. It was the most effective strategic session Harry had ever been part of. At one point, deep in the analysis of Voldemort's tactical patterns, Salazar said something that made Dumbledore go very still and then say, slowly, "I hadn't considered that angle," with the specific quality of a man encountering a genuinely new idea, which was something Harry suspected didn't happen to Dumbledore often. Salazar received this with quiet satisfaction and continued. At 2 in the morning, when the main shape of the plan was clear and documented and distributed, the meeting dissolved. Dumbledore walked to his window and looked out at the dark grounds with the expression of someone doing a private reckoning, and Harry paused at the door. "Get some sleep," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him with those eyes that were old and honest and complicated. "You as well," he said. "Harry," he stopped, the way he sometimes stopped now, in the middle of the careful sentences, because he was practicing not finishing them with strategic purpose and the practice was still new. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what you've built these past weeks. The council. He gestured vaguely, which encompassed, Harry understood, the curriculum and bones and the curriculum and the trial record and the changed texture of the school and probably several other things he'd been watching and not commenting on. For the school that is beginning to be what it should be. We're building it," Harry said. "All of us." That was the point. He left Dumbledore at his window and went down through the quiet castle, the ring pulsing its steady heartbeat on his hand, and thought about the days ahead with the clear-eyed focus of someone who knows what's coming and has chosen not to flinch from it. The Founders walked the corridors with him in companionable silence for a while, Godric beside him, Helga and Rowena a few paces behind, Salazar at his shoulder. They passed the great hall, whose doors were slightly open, and the ceiling was visible through the gap, still holding the sky's reflection even at this hour, the specific nighttime version of its magic, dark and full of stars, the accurate night sky projected above the empty tables with the patient fidelity of something that had been doing this for 1,000 years and found it sufficient work. At the foot of the Gryffindor Tower stairs, the Founders stopped. Harry turned. They were standing in a loose group in the corridor, for people who had built something enormous and watched it survive and warp and be contested and had come back to straighten it, who had found an heir and kept a promise and were standing now at the threshold of the last significant thing this particular covenant required. "When it's done," Godric said, "come back here." Harry looked at him. "When Voldemort is finished," Godric said. "Come back to the school. Not as the boy who survived it. As the person building it." He met Harry's eyes with that warm specific gravity. "There's work here that needs you." "I know," Harry said. "Also," Godric said, and the gravity shifted back to the warmth, "I want to watch you play Quidditch properly before we leave. I have opinions about your feint that I haven't fully expressed." "You expressed them mid-air during practice," Harry said. "I expressed a summary," Godric said. "I have a full analysis." Harry laughed, and the laugh went up the stone corridor and into the castle's bones, and the castle held it the way it held everything honest that was said within its walls. He climbed the stairs to Gryffindor Tower and went to bed and slept deeply and without dreaming, and when he woke the ring was warm on his hand and the morning was clear and the school was full of ordinary sounds, students waking, doors, distant laughter, the castle settling in its habitual morning way, and everything was still hard and still frightening and still absolutely unfinished, and he lay in bed for a moment and felt all of that and then got up. He got dressed. He picked up his wand. He looked at the ring on his hand, all 4 stones quiet in the morning light, waiting, present, and he went down to breakfast, because the day was beginning and the work was there and he was ready for it. He was Harry Potter. Godric's heir. His mother's son. His own person. Nobody's weapon and nobody's sacrifice and nobody's managed instrument, just himself, entirely and clearly himself, walking down the stairs into the life he was building on his own terms, with the right people around him and the right foundation under his feet. The castle's morning light came through the staircase windows in long gold bars, and the ring caught it and threw it back in 4 colors, and Harry walked through them and kept going.